Great. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar today on teaching and teachers in education systems. Joe, can you go ahead and go to the next slide for us? Oh, great. Actually, one more slide. Perfect. Okay, thank you. So this webinar is part of a 7-week messaging campaign that we are in the midst of as the RISE program that's working to distill and disseminate key policy messages that have emerged from the RISE program's work over the last 7 years. This webinar relates to our support for teaching message, which is going to be the focus of next week's part of the campaign. And so today we have a 2-part webinar, which together is going to explore the question of how can education authorities and organizations develop empowered, highly respected, strongly performance normed, contextually embedded teaching professionals who cultivate student learning. Okay, so we have a very manageable task ahead of us, clearly. But that's what we're going to try to tackle over the next few hours. Joe, can you go ahead and go to the next slide? Thank you. Great. So in this first part of the webinar, we have an excellent lineup of researchers who have been involved in a variety of the RISE program research teams who are going to discuss what we have learned about supporting high quality teaching over the course of the program. And so rather than focus on technical research findings, the panel has instead been prompted to share bigger picture reflections that they see coming out of the growing evidence base on these topics. So each panelist will give a short initial presentation, and then we will open for questions and discussion with the audience. After that, we'll take a 10-minute break. So we're going to finish at 5 minutes till 3:30. We'll finish right about 3:25 in the East Coast, or I'm sorry, in the UK. And then we'll come back after a 10-minute break for part 2 of the webinar. Just briefly on logistics, both the chat and the Q&A features are open on this webinar. In the chat, feel free to have discussions and post discussions or comments. But for any questions that you want to be directed at the panelists, please put those in the Q&A. That's what we will monitor for feeding questions to the panelists during the Q&A session of this. Joe, go ahead and go to the next one. Just a teaser for part 2. Part 2 of the webinar is going to launch a new ambitious volume on teacher norms and include a roundtable discussion on linkages between teacher professional norms and student learning. So just to say, I hope that you're able to stick around for this part as well. And so with that, I will go ahead and introduce our panelists for the first part and get started. Joe, I think one more slide there. Perfect. Okay. So first we'll be hearing from Cynthia Revina, who is a researcher with the SMERU Research Institute in Indonesia and a member of the RISE Indonesia team. Unfortunately, Cynthia can't be here with us in person today, but she has kindly provided a video presentation that we will listen to. Following Cynthia, we will hear from Soufia Siddiqi, who's an assistant professor at the Lahore University of Management Sciences and a member of the RISE Political Economy of Adoption team. Then we'll hear from Joan DeJaeghere, who's professor at the University of Minnesota and a principal investigator on the RISE Vietnam team. We'll hear next from Jacobus Cilliers, associate teaching professor at Georgetown University and member of the RISE Tanzania team, who I believe also will be presenting via video, but will be here live for the Q&A portion of it. And then finally, Yue-Yi, who is RISE research manager with the University of Oxford. So with that, we will go ahead and start with the video from Cynthia.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Cynthia Revina. I work for RISE Indonesia Country Research Team at the SMERU Research Institute, Jakarta. And today I'm happy to share some findings from our studies on teachers. And in total, we have about 10 studies on teachers. And in this presentation, I will share 3 most important ones. So the first one is from a study on the quality of teacher education program for our pre-service teachers. And in this mixed method study, we found that the 1-year additional certification training for pre-service teachers, which is on top of 4 years of bachelor's education, had no impact on teacher skills and on their effectiveness in the classrooms. When we compare certified teachers with their uncertified counterparts who only completed the first degree from the same university and with the same year of experience, no significant added value was observed. Some explanation from education stakeholders revealed that the completion of initial teacher training, such as bachelor's degree or the teaching certification program, are mainly seen by the teachers and more generally by the system to fulfill the administrative side, to be formally hired, or to get the teaching allowance. Some school principals mentioned that a degree or certificate is matters for teachers' careers, but it may not give much of additional knowledge to them. So education stakeholders believe that teacher personal attributes such as their grades or GPA, whether they pass the National University Entrance Exam when they first enroll to the teaching program, and whether they bring with them this personality of being adaptive, matters more for teachers' development. And our result actually echoes the finding from the infamous Double for Nothing paper that found no effect from government intervention on teachers despite the incentives provided for them. So next is from a longitudinal qualitative study on 16 novice teachers who just completed their teacher training program. So from this emotionally engaging study, I could say that because we did this study for 2 years long, we know that the young teachers receive little support in terms of professional mentorships or financial incentives during their early years. All the hardships they experience during these years made them think that their priority was to win the civil servant status or to get opportunity to be certified as soon as possible, because this status would bring so many benefits. On the other hand, if they could not pass the civil servant exam or not being certified, they should bear with low salary with full-time workload for unlimited period of time. Under such situation, we can imagine how learning to be an effective teacher has never been a top goal that's shared by these teachers. It is just not encouraged by the current system, since good teaching performance will not bring value to them. Here, compliance and willingness to take non-teaching jobs matters more and appreciated more. As a result, civil servant status is seen as central to teachers' professional integrity and their commitment to stay in the profession. Many teachers in our study also aware that teaching job can be their stepping stone for higher civil servant later in the future, such as to be a high-rank officials at the local education agency. And finally, we learned that the reform on Indonesia's teacher hiring system is challenged by both institutional and social factors. Some explanation to this. First, we have a complex institutional problem in teacher hiring. There are two most common ways of hiring a teacher in public schools. One is through civil servant system. Although I say two, in fact, this is the only formal and legitimate way to apply for a job as a public school teacher. And multiple ministries actually involved in the civil servant teacher management, but none of them take the ownership to ensure the quality of the recruited teachers. The system just follow the general civil servant exam for all professions, so there is no specific attention to the teaching ability of the applicants. Here, as long as candidate can pass administrative shortlist process and the multiple choice exam, they will be hired as teachers until their pension age. There is no curation, no evaluation of performance during their early years. Second, but illegitimate way to work as a teacher in public schools is called contract or honorary teachers. The term contract is misleading because the teachers have no contract at all with any party, not even with the school they're working at. And the term honorary is actually rooted in Indonesian term honorer, meaning you will receive wage based on your presence at school, often counted hourly. And for these nearly voluntary posts, there is no formal recruitment process. So second issue is rooted in the political economy environment of the teaching profession. Here, all actors from the Member of Parliament, Ministry Education officers, local education agency officers, school principals to teachers themselves are taking advantages from our ineffective recruitment system for both civil servant and honorary teachers. Third is the social expectation that prioritize seniority and administrative compliance or superficial criteria of being an educator rather than merit as indicators of teacher performance. So our findings show that many teachers actually demand, especially the honorary teachers, demand for an automatic promotion to be civil servant, meaning they would like to be exempted from high-stake exam or receiving special treatment in the exam criteria. We know our civil servant exam system is flawless, and now they is not flawless, and now they want to be exempted from exam, no exam at all. And during political years for the past 2 decades, there are often policies or regulations that granted this request in one way or another, as long as teacher can show that they have served long enough and complied with the administrative standards. So yeah, I think that's all I can share with you in this presentation, and thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks to Cynthia for that great video. So Sophia, we'll turn over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Soufia Siddiqi. I'm going to take you through a few slides. They'll be a little bit dense in text. Don't worry, we'll talk about it, but it's going to give you some background to the context that I was working in, which is a province called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan. And I'm going to focus on one specific problem out of a much larger research project that I've been working on and continue to work on still. So I'm just going to share my slides and I'm going to take it to full screen, and hopefully that is visible. Michelle, could I get a thumbs up if it is?
Looks great. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so the big question on everyone's mind all the time is, how do we get the system to start learning and behaving well? And, the literature by now is substantial in that response, which is get good teachers. So KP is a province, if many of you are not familiar, it was the front line of the war on terror, in which Pakistan participated actively for about a decade of the country's existence, between about 2004-ish, 5-ish, all the way to 2015 or 16. And the story of KP is fundamentally intertwined with the war, because the devastation left the private sector completely collapsed and destroyed. So as a result, government jobs were the only real stable income options for most people. And this is something that the state decided to capitalize on. So what's the problem here? Although I look at these three kind of questions as part of my larger project, what I want to focus on today is how the significant policy shift in 2014 caused both positive outcomes but equally problematic outcomes for state education planners, because the government at the time was facing two big problems. One was we have a lot of kids who have received an education over the years of the war on terror, but they were being educated in a different province or city maybe, and now they need jobs, and their preference is to find a job within the same province because their families are predominantly based here. At the same time, what they saw was that there was a short supply of teachers, and this is where the conversation started from. So, sorry, it's not moving ahead. Sorry, it's just a second. Here we go. So here's a little bit of context. Before the 2014 policy was brought in, where there was a significant revision to teacher recruitment requirements, everything which had a kind of professional certification or teacher licensing requirement, or you had to demonstrate the ability to teach, all of that was classified as a barrier to entry by the government at the time. This was a new government which had come in. It had come in on a wave of popular mandate, and they wanted to kind of tell their people, the electorate, that we care about you, and especially we care about the young people who are mostly unemployed. So they took away what they called the barriers to entry, which was they removed all, at the time they called it suspension, but eventually they removed all requirements to come in with a teaching background. You could just come in with a university degree, and if you met a certain kind of GPA standard, criteria, that you would qualify as a first step, and then you would take a third-party examination, which was pretty general because it had just a quantitative component and then an English component, similar to what the SAT would be. And then if you made the merit, then you would qualify to become a teacher and you'd be recruited. So the results are in front of you. It was no longer mandatory to have teaching certification or a degree or a license and some such, which meant that there were more candidates actively applying for these jobs. And I'll come to some of the problems that resulted from this philosophy. But it did mean that KP then became a province which, in its settled districts, which are different to the tribal areas, these were merged in later, but in most of KP, every primary school now has at least 2 teachers appointed, which doesn't mean that they're enough, but it is something that the government likes to boast about. The new teachers came in with much better qualifications in general, which are a master's degree or an MPhil or even a PhD. And then all of them had to go through about 6 to 9 months of state designed and mandated induction training, which now leads to a test it didn't before. It leads to a very easy test. And once they've completed the test, it's not graded, just the completion itself awards you a certificate. So that's a problem as well. And finally, even though on induction you would receive a contract, so it's a little bit different to what we just heard from the Indonesian case, the contract holds weight, but it's not a guarantee of permanence. Permanence and promotion throughout the public system will only be guaranteed once eventually a teacher does take some kind of examination and receives a professional teaching certification. So it raises a lot of contradictions about what the system is trying to accomplish. So what we figured out was, we've got a teacher supply shortage and we've met it. And there's a huge demand for jobs and we've provided those jobs by lifting barriers to entry. So all kinds of trained backgrounds could come in, but it's a little bit like out of the frying pan into the fire, because now the narrative is split. Like, can anyone teach? And what does that mean for me as a teacher? Am I respected because I'm a government servant, or am I respected for my professional teaching performance and responsibilities? And where you've got a lot more teachers coming into the system, you've also got a drop in quality. And then we've got a system of exit strategies where a lot of teachers are thinking about where to move next. And definitely most of them want to move out of primary schooling because it doesn't pay a lot. There's not a good rank associated with it. And so there aren't a lot of privileges or perks. And that's actually a disincentive to specialize in primary or stick to it and get better at that particular tier of schooling or teaching, really. And then that overall,
Soufia, 2-minute warning.
Okay, great, thanks. And all of these have contributed to like an overall professional devaluation of the teaching profession. So it's actually really interesting because what the system was trying to do was solve the problem of not having enough people motivated to become teachers and help students, but it's actually ended up backfiring on the system, where everyone now feels like I'm not very important because it seems like anyone can teach and you just have to stick around, which I've mentioned in the criteria for promotion. And if you stick around long enough, you'll eventually move up the system. So what can we do very quickly? And I can return to these slides during Q&A. I'm mindful of time. So the system needs to be flexible and open up multiple teacher entry pathways. So if you're not trained, yes, you can apply, but then this is the kind of curriculum to which you have to prepare and demonstrate some kind of minimum ability. And that could be in different forms, right? So it could be interviews, it could be a case interview, it could be a proper case test, so on and so forth. You could be trained but not have teaching experience, so go through a set of certifications. You could be trained with teaching experience, and then you could qualify for like a lateral induction scheme, which is similar to what we have in other parts of the civil service. And then you have those alternative teaching pathways, so you can move from other teaching experiences into the public system. And you could also specialize teaching by tier, that's number 2. And number 3 is that instead of having like really generic promotional criteria, kind of localize and contextualize teachers' promotional criteria to the hardships that they challenge themselves with, or that the system challenges them with. 2 final points: make teaching cadres flexible. So don't just compel primary teachers to keep teaching for the rest of their lives. Incentivize them to do other things as well. And finally, the data which is available in the system, use it more creatively so that it feeds back in both to professional development continuously and at the recruitment stage. And then I'll answer the rest with any questions. So that's what I learned from PB context. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Soufia. Joan, I'll go ahead and hand over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here in this webinar. I'm going to speak today to supporting teachers and quality of teaching in Vietnam. As I was introduced, I lead the RISE Vietnam team, along with a number of colleagues who worked with me over the years on several different analyses and papers, Hung Duong, Vu Dao, Thi Nguyen, and many, many researchers from the Vietnam National Institute of Education Sciences. So I want to briefly share with you a set of questions that we've been looking at over the last 6 years through a lot of different data, and then to hone in on a particular one. So we have tried to examine how school and community conditions support teaching and learning for all students. And we've done this both through quantitative and qualitative data, but I'll be speaking more to our qualitative analyses today. In our qualitative analyses, we also particularly looked at how teacher and teaching practices are associated with high learning outcomes in Vietnam. As many of you may know and has been talked about in other webinars, Vietnam sort of stands as an outlier here among these RISE countries because it has had very high learning outcomes on PISA tests. And so we've tried to look at what has promoted that, or what has fostered those learning outcomes. But importantly, here in Vietnam, there's a transition to not just content-heavy laden curriculum and testing, but to competency-based reform that's been ongoing in Vietnam for almost 10 years now, meaning it was initiated 10 years ago. It's just being implemented now, and I'll speak to that. So we wanted to understand how teachers foster competency-based learning. And finally, we wanted to look at how does, and partly for this conversation today, how does education change occur when purposes and practices shift? And here I'm referring to the purposes and practices of moving away from a content-based curriculum and maybe some student-centered learning to one that's really competency-based. And so the research project has been vast over the last 6 years, and I'm going to speak again just primarily to the qualitative data. We drew from a larger quantitative sample, which looked at 100 secondary schools as well as 140 primary schools, but we focused in on 20 secondary schools in our qualitative research across the country. And in those schools, we interviewed principals, teachers, community leaders, and students over a 3-year period. We also did classroom observations with video cameras for grades 7, 8, and 9. And then we used those videos to solicit sort of a post-observation reflection with teachers as well. We also interviewed many national education leaders as well as some provincial education leaders, and our analysis is based on all of these different forms of data. So I want to speak first to what might support teachers to achieve sort of student learning outcomes on tests. And we have several RISE working papers that I'll refer to that are also probably in the chat for you on these outcomes. First was that we found that if teachers have beliefs that all students can learn, then those schools and those students actually do better. Where we found when teachers believe that students didn't have the ability to learn, those students weren't achieving as well. And this was a comparison we did between sort of high learning outcomes in certain classrooms versus lower learning outcomes in other classrooms. Similarly, we found when we compared high and low learning outcome classrooms that metacognitive teaching, which was aimed to support learning how to learn, really fostered higher learning, especially on these on learning outcome assessments like PISA. And finally, we make an argument in one of our papers that teachers also engage in what we call hybrid teaching, which is not just the focus on content and teacher-centered teaching, but really is combining content with a conducive learning environment for students to practice their learning. So all of these are kind of aspects that we found that fostered high learning outcomes as measured on tests. And these are several of the papers that speak to those different outcomes. But what really could then foster sort of deep teachers' practices for deep learning, or what supports teachers to change toward greater competencies and fostering deep learning? And herein lies sort of a tension for teachers because they are trying to shift from teaching content and achieving on tests, which is still important in the current curriculum, as well as teaching for life and other valued outcomes. And in this paper that we're working on now, and in this analysis, we turn to Rincon Gallardo's framework for talking about change in education systems. And importantly, he talks about political change, or in the political arena, where you have to leverage and shift institutional power and interactions between actors. You also have to have a very clear sense of what learning is, or what deep learning is, what you're committing to as a purpose. And then he also talks about in the pedagogical arena or school arena that principals and teachers everyday actions need to change around teaching and learning. And then very importantly then in the social arena, you need to create these sort of collective stories about what the purposes of schooling are, especially as they shift, and have these sort of deliberative dialogues among different educational actors and what he calls creating a cultural change. So working with these different arenas all together, this is to create a sort of cultural shift or change. So when we analyze our data across our interviews with policymakers down to the districts and with our teachers and principals and schools, what did we find around this sort of cultural shift towards a deeper learning, a competency-based learning?
And Joan, just a 2-minute warning.
Yep. So first of all, we found competencies are clearly articulated. As I said, they initiated in 2012 a competency-based reform. They worked for many years to define those competencies, to articulate standards, to develop a curriculum. So that's pretty clear across the system. There are shared commitments across the system and the different actors and institutions around education, but they do see varied purposes about what those competencies or what education is supposed to achieve. In the pedagogical arena, teachers have exposure to practice. They've been trained on competencies over multiple years now. They do get to practice it. They have these learning communities that they meet with every couple of weeks within their schools and across schools where they can share ideas. But they have little feedback, and principals are less engaged in their competency development, and they don't get as much feedback about it. And that, I think, creates these learning communities for teachers to then focus more on the technical aspects of teaching and less on the shared meaning and creating what does it look like to teach this sort of competencies. And in part, this is because test results are still the primary source of information. So on the social side of the arena, there's really little dialogue. There is communication and input coming down from from government to the schools and back up from schools to the government, but there's no real dialogue to create shared understanding around these purposes. And again, testing remains a hierarchical form of accountability. So to conclude, what did we conclude from this sort of analysis? That technical solutions won't necessarily create the kind of change needed in collective purposes of education and in teachers' everyday actions. that these sort of shifting purposes and norms and beliefs really require dialogue at all levels, and that hierarchical accountability, which exists quite strongly in a Vietnamese sort of government system, really actually impedes the kind of cultural change that's necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. Okay, over to Yue-Yi. I think I misspoke on the order of presenters earlier, but Yue-Yi is next, and we'll hear from Jacobus last.
Great, let me just get my slides up. And okay, so one of my roles at RISE is a synthesized research.
Yue-Yi, we can see we're seeing the notes and presenters kind of things.
Let me do that. You don't need
share
to
your other screen.
I will do a new share, and sorry,
You can see your desktop. There you go. Okay.
Ugh. You think I would have a handle on this by now, but give me a minute. So anyway, so I'm just going to start resharing that. Apologies, everyone. We did text check just now, but there's always at least one person who messes it up live. And in this case, it happened to be me. Right. So anyway, so I synthesized research on teachers and management at RISE. And as you saw in my notes just now, I'm going to talk about a piece that I co-wrote with Lant Pritchett. And in this piece, we talk about 5 principles for teacher careers, and we call these the 5 C's. So choose and curate toward commitment to capable and committed teachers. And I'm going to focus on the curate part. And I'm also going to tell you about something I learned in the course of doing the synthesis project, because we are trying to do reflections. So as Michelle said at the start, you know, in this webinar, and as well as in this paper on teacher careers, we start with this vision of what we want for the teaching profession. We want teachers to be empowered and respected and contextually embedded teaching professionals. But this is quite a lofty vision compared to frontline realities for teachers in many countries. So, for example, many education systems in the global south are in the midst of what's called the learning crisis, where if you look at the purple bar on the left, among 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries who are enrolled in school, almost half of them aren't learning how to read, and that's even pre-COVID, right? And when it comes to teachers, in the example on the left, teachers often aren't equipped to do the work that they're expected to do. So there are lots of indications also in the example on the right, for example, that the teaching profession also often has lost a sense of its professional purpose. So, you know, it's completely true that there are dedicated and transformative teachers in education systems everywhere, but it's also true that teacher absenteeism is a massive problem in many places, because unfortunately, in some contexts, it's acceptable to get paid even if you don't show up or if you show up late, or in many contexts, teachers are often called away from the classroom for official duties that are completely unrelated to teaching. So when I started working on this paper with Lant, I agreed that we really need to address the fact that in many settings, being a teacher isn't primarily about classroom teaching, because that's really bad for students and it's really bad for teachers. But I wasn't sure that I agreed with Lant about what he thought should be a principle for moving forward. So Lant had previously co-authored a paper with someone else where he argued for a particular kind of teacher career structure in order to truly professionalize teaching. And this was in the context of India. And I think it's easiest to explain Lant's proposal in contrast to the status quo. So here, in a typical civil service approach to teaching, you know, teachers might have a kind of nominal probation period. So a very small number of really egregiously irresponsible teachers might not complete their probation. And of course, you know, a small number might quit along the way. But on the whole, the number of teachers in each cohort is really stable until retirement because it's a secure job. So in contrast, under some versions of a 5 C's approach, we'd expect to see lots of teachers leave the profession during the novice phase. And, you know, ideally, this would be voluntary because the profession will have high internal standards, and those who realize that they can't or that they don't want to meet those standards would go to another field. And we call this trial period, this novice period, the curate period, where curation implies finding the best possible selection for a given purpose, right? Like how in a museum exhibition, it's curated from the full set of artworks and artifacts in the museum's collection. And curation actually also implies caring for all the artworks and artifacts so they're at the best. So in pre-service and novice teaching, that would also mean giving these teachers all the support they need so they have the best possible chance of being capable and committed teachers, right? Anyway, so when Lant first described this approach to me, I thought, you know, I guess that makes sense, but it looks so costly and it's already so hard to deliver high quality pre-service teacher education, and so many places have teacher shortages. So why would we want to waste all of that? But as I looked more at the research and I also reflected on the time I'd spent as a novice teacher at home in Malaysia, eventually I was persuaded that curation actually really is an important principle for teacher careers. And I was persuaded for 3 reasons. The first reason is just that the standardized indicators that we have about pre-service teaching candidates just don't capture enough information to help education authorities and schools make good decisions about who will be a capable and committed teacher in the long term, right? We see this in studies from multiple contexts, including this RISE Indonesia study. And, if this is true for test-based measures of children's academic learning, it's way more true for children's socio-emotional development and like other vital but less quantifiable aspects of their development. So, and this fact that standardized selection measures empirically don't seem to gather enough information about prospective teachers made sense to me because, teaching is complex, right? It's an interaction between teachers and students and content and their environment. So thinking about this made me a bit more inclined to agree that, okay, maybe this curation thing through time spent in the classroom does matter. But the second reason is related to the fact that the lack of good pre-service information also applies to prospective teachers themselves. So personally, in my case, when I was applying to be a teacher, a lot of people are like, oh, you do so well in school, I'm sure you'll be a great teacher. And then there are all these like narratives and movies and recruitment material. In this case, literally, this was a picture from one of my real classrooms that was really on recruitment material for teaching in Malaysia. Just presents this wonderful image of teachers who revolutionize their students' lives. And you're like, oh, maybe that could be me. But then sometimes classroom teaching looks like this. Again, this is a real picture of one of my real classrooms. And the point is that classroom teaching is complex. So even prospective teachers themselves don't usually have a sense of how much you'll enjoy teaching until you get to the actual classroom. Like I had no idea how much I'd struggle with classroom management. And this matters because it's really hard to continue improving your professional craft if you constantly feel demoralized. Right. And the third reason that persuaded me that this curation thing is important is that research on labor markets where there's extensively available and analyzed data, which unfortunately does usually mean the US and developed countries, shows that early career turnover is actually a normal part of most professions. And it can be beneficial because the opportunity to try out different professions mean that there's a better chance of occupational match quality, as it's called, which is good for both employers and for the people doing the work themselves. Okay. So all of that is why I was persuaded that curation is an important principle for teacher career reform alongside the other 5 C's, which you can see on the screen.
Yue-Yi, just under 2 minutes left.
Okay, great. Part of my initial reaction when Lat was telling me this whole curate thing was also, this curate thing sounds really costly. So over the course of working on the synthesis project, my views actually on the costliness point also shifted. So in this paper on teacher careers, we talk about different kinds of complexity in the teaching profession, but I'm just going to focus on this one, which is the fact that teacher motivation is made up of many interacting components. And for convenience, we group these into 4 buckets. So finances, material circumstances, personal satisfaction, and social validation. And these interacting elements of motivation are key to why I now think that curation is a worthwhile cost, because what this curation period does, I think this relates to what Soufia was talking about actually, is it helps establish professional standards, right? Both because the combination of choose and curate means that not just anybody can become a teacher, and also because treating the novice phase as a distinct period in the teaching profession clearly communicates the norm that teaching is a craft, that you need to learn and refine it over time in collaboration with more experienced teachers. And while it's costly in some ways, if you commit from day one, like a typical civil service career structure, that has its own cost, because if you don't have strong professional standards to support teachers' personal satisfaction and social validation, then the system has to depend on just 2 of the 4 motivational sources. So either this means you have to spend lots and lots of money on salaries to really retain capable and committed teachers, or it comes at the cost of cultivating students' learning. And if those are the alternatives, I think curation is the more worthwhile cost. So I'm now a convert to the fact that curation matters in teacher careers, and there's the paper, and thank you very much. Sorry for the issue with slides and running over.
No, you're right on time.
Oh,
2
perfect.
seconds left. Great, thank you, Yue-Yi. Okay, the last is the video that we have from Jacobus. Sam, I believe you might have that ready to go. Perfect, thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to take you through an extended example of how it will feel if you go through the typical type of professional development that teachers go through in most developing countries, if you want to become a baker. So imagine that you want to become a baker. So you attend the pre-service training at the best university, and you're taught chemistry and philosophy of baking, but you never actually bake a cake. Then after graduating, you go and start working, but realize you have none of the ingredients you need, nor the equipment you need. And it turns out that people are expecting you to make ugali and not cake. This is your first cake, and this is how you feel about baking. Now, this is a typical kind of support that teachers would expect to get. Now, imagine as a baker, somebody comes in every now and again, inspects your ingredients, inspects your equipment, tastes your ugali, assesses you on the tasting of your ugali, but doesn't actually observe you doing the baking or giving you feedback on how to bake. You're invited to go to a bunch of different lectures on cooking that are unrelated, but again, no practical demonstration on how to actually do it. And then people complain that the quality of ugali is really bad in your country. This is how you feel about baking. Now, I want to talk you through the support that you will need to become a very good baker or teacher, and there's a lot of evidence on this front. First, evidence that has shown great success is that you really need a recipe book that is simple and appropriate for your needs, that tells you actually what you need to do every day in order to bake the right products. These are the lesson plans that can be very effective for teachers. Second, you need practical demonstration telling you, showing you how to actually teach. Third, you need a lot of opportunities to practice, try things out, make mistakes maybe, get frequent feedback, and continuous support for ongoing improvements. And fourth, you need the appropriate teaching and learning resources that are actually linked to the type of teaching activities you're expected to do. Now, I'm just going to give you one very specific example. There is a lot of evidence showing how this combination of 4 elements that I just showed before have shown remarkable and large effects and impacts on student learning in developing countries. In South Africa, we compared 2 different types of teacher professional development. One is training, really good training combined with a bunch of resources, and one is coaching. And the coach can provide this practical demonstration and ongoing feedback and continuous support. And the coaching was twice as effective and far more cost-effective than training itself. Now, there's a foundational set of elements that are required. And this is clear and consistent expectations on what is actually required. That you're supposed to be doing ugali and not baking, and you get the appropriate training to do that. So these expectations link to both the student competencies that are required and also the actual teaching techniques that are required. And what's really, really, really important is that you need alignment between all the different lines of ministry and all the different agencies working in education on these expectations. And unfortunately, teachers are going to allocate and schools are going to allocate their effort towards whatever gets measured. So I just want to give you 2 examples from a country where I've worked in. And I think this is not uncommon in developing countries. One is to introduce a new curriculum that was more competency-based in the early grades. Turns out adoption was really bad. The teachers said that they still get assessed on the old curriculum, so there's no point in them teaching the new curriculum if the assessment is wrong. Another example is that they've tried to do this push towards focusing on early grade reading, and especially improvements in the early grades. But the assessment happens in the later grades. And this is what the schools get rewarded upon. So this just shows that you really need this alignment of expectations across the board. Great, thank you very much. I'm a horrible baker, and I need a lot of additional support in order to improve in my baking.
Excellent. Thanks, Jacobus, for the great video and the guest appearance by maybe the most adorable member of the RISE research program. Extra credit for that. I'm going to go ahead and ask all of our speakers to go ahead and, if you don't mind, turn your videos on, and we will launch into some discussion. And also a reminder to participants at the webinar, put your questions, comments for our panelists in that Q&A function, and we will feed them to the panelists during our discussion period. So I think we saw a lot of great content, a lot of which kind of the presentations speak to each other on a lot of these themes. And I think we've certainly seen what a complex undertaking it is, right? To think about teachers and teaching, career paths, motivation, and all the other elements that go into effective teaching in the classroom. These aren't simple things, but we're going to see if we can dig into them in a little bit more depth. So I have a few questions already from the chat ready to go. So I will share some questions over with our panelists. One question was posed to Cynthia, but since she's not with us, it actually is a question that I think is really great for everyone. So I'm going to reframe it slightly. But the question was, have these findings been shared with the relevant Ministry of Education, policymakers, and if so, what's the response from the government? So I'm just wondering if I'll let people self-select into that one. If you'd like to give some comments on how receptive government folks have been to some of these research findings and how they resonate with what they see needing to happen. Another one that's also a bit broad, and I'll let people kind of select into answering it, is how do the findings regarding teachers relate to learning outcomes targets or learner performance statistics in country, right? And so this is always the tricky thing. How do you measure the outcomes or impacts of teacher career reforms or other teacher support mechanisms? And how have you seen that come out in your research in terms of what's been effective in terms of learning outcomes? And for Joan, I'll leave it at 3 for this round. For Joan, did beliefs of teachers that all children can learn lead to learning improvement or score improvement? And then what I think really gets at the heart of this is how did Vietnam build this belief that all children can learn? I think that's a really critical question that's relevant in a lot of contexts. So any insight in kind of how they built that would be great. Does anyone want to jump in, or I can kind of call on people to go in a little bit of an order to field the first couple that are to everyone? Okay, Soufia, I saw you nodding your head as I was posing those, so I'll go to you first, and then maybe Jacobus, and then Joan come to you after that.
Okay, I was half nodding and I was also laughing because you were asking about whether we've tried to present our work to the government and what the response has been like. And the reason I'm laughing is because it's so mixed. Even the response is so telling about why you might be stuck in the problems that you are, where there's like the political economy is really just, it's sitting on this fundamental tension between those who have to keep the system preserved in terms of the status quo, which is usually the bureaucracy, and that's their role to kind of keep the system going. And then those who want to maybe experiment with different ideas, whether wrong or right from a technical perspective, and that's usually in the political domain. And that was my experience, even kind of trying to share some of these ideas with both the political partners and the bureaucratic partners in the KP government. And the funny thing is, like, the guy's not there anymore, but the then secretary of the elementary and secondary education department, just every time I would try to present one of these ideas, he would say, we're already doing it. And then I would say, okay, well, let me show you another one and we can come back and talk about the first one maybe. And then this kept going on for like 20 minutes. And every time I would say, well, maybe we can hear a little bit more about how you guys are operationalizing this, because some of these are really complicated moves. And he says, we'll talk about it another day. And then like a few months later, I found out he had been transferred. And then somebody from the department said, actually, nothing of what you had been recommending has even been discussed for implementation. So it'd be great if you could send us like a more detailed write-up of how to follow up on this. So in that sense, there is an appetite within departments, especially amongst the younger lot or people who want to get their vote back. I think that they're a lot more receptive, but then there's always going to be people within the system whose jobs depend on them saying at exactly the right time or already on it. And it just depends, I think, on who you're having a conversation with at a particular point in time. And it's not as simple as saying, oh, this is a reform oriented or reform-minded person. I think it also depends on when you have that conversation and what their individual political economy might be looking like at that point in time as well. So I just want to share that experience, and it made me laugh about what had happened to me. I'm still going ahead and pushing some of these things with them. I remember saying, just final thought on this, I remember saying to the secretary at the time, where he said, what is so special about you coming and telling me how my department operates? And I mean, I think it was a little bit cheeky of me to say it, but I couldn't resist. I said, the difference is that I will be working with your department for many years because I'm the researcher and you might be gone in the next 6 months. And incidentally, he was gone in the next 6 months. So I was like, okay, I got to be careful what I say to people now. But that kind of, puts into perspective just how important that push for sustained research is when you're talking to policymakers, and you never know when they might turn around and finally be willing to listen.
Great. Let me just add off that.
Absolutely.
And just I use that opportunity to answer another question about integrating coaches into in-service training. And so the first thing I want to say, of course, sometimes it's arrogant from the researchers to think just because we have an idea, government is going to implement it. And they have, like Soufia said, their own political economy, their own constraints and incentives, and a bunch of different considerations at play. And we are only focused in one different area. And so what worked really well in South Africa was there was so much buy-in from the start that this was the official government initiative that we were evaluating, is that they couldn't walk back after we found the success, because they really owned it from the beginning. But that's hard to do, and that's years, like Soufia said, years and years of engagement and deep engagement with multiple different actors at the same time. And so, so if you want to influence policy, you got to wait for people to come to you. You got to be sitting on the sidelines waiting for them to come to you when they actually want to make change. You can't just expect because you have an idea people will do that. And so, but this big question of we know coaching is really effective, but how to integrate that into existing in-service professional development systems in government. All education systems that I've worked in or know about often have this tier of government right above the schools, where there's these education officers that visit schools and kind of are the conduit of communication between kind of local government and schools. And they have been successful in Kenya with Ben Piper's Tusome project, and also in India with some of the Teaching at the Right Level initiatives to play this role. But again, this coach, but again, this is this importance of alignment across the whole system, because for them to do that, there needs to be prioritization from their superiors that this is what they should be doing, because they have so many different tasks they're already working on. And so that's why I think any kind of specific targeted teacher professional development, it has to be both local government and central government, all the ministries, to be really on the same page in terms of what needs to happen for everybody in the system to play a role in doing that. And just to mention, I wasn't the person in South African study. There was somebody in the Department of Education driving it forward. I was the outsider. No credit to me.
Thanks, Jacobus. Great stuff. Joan, do you want to come in, and then Yue-Yi can come in as well? Great.
Sure. Let me say a comment briefly first about the first kind of question about presenting to policymakers and how do they perceive it. I would say similarly, right, that from what the other speakers were saying, that we present our data to them, but it isn't always, right, received or taken up or used. In fact, it's sometimes countered, and that may be in part, and I would say not just alignment, as Jacobus was just talking about, but I would say because it doesn't quite fit with the cultural narrative that the government officials and others are trying to craft, right? So if they have their own political agendas, we would call it, or cultural narrative they're trying to create around education, that our studies are only part of it, and they may have other kind of explanations. At least in Vietnam, there's many explanations and data that they'll bring to sort of counter our own studies, even if we show this sort of value and the rigor behind our work. I wanted to speak to the question briefly about teachers' beliefs, because that was posed, and I would say, so in Vietnam, that, by the way, that study that we did actually looked at teachers' beliefs in support of learning and whether their beliefs also affected the way that they taught, the practices they used in the classroom, and then whether that constituted greater testing outcomes, yes, but also deeper cognitive learning, right? Higher order thinking. And it also interestingly examined the difference between, or found actually that teachers were more prone to have those beliefs about Kim majority students than they did about ethnic minority students in Vietnam. So it's not that while they held beliefs that all students can learn, they held beliefs that some students can learn to a higher level. And this is actually fostered, I think. So someone asked about, well, how does that belief get fostered in Vietnam? And I think it's through sort of a two-part, more aspects, but I'm going to speak to two parts. One is, in general, there's again a cultural narrative in Vietnam that education and learning is important, right? So everyone sort of buys into that. Every child should have this equitable opportunity to go to school. That's strongly kind of in the socialist system. It's also more even kind of in a more Vietnamese cultural kind of heritage around the role, importance of education and learning. And then teachers are actually rewarded, of course, if students meet, if the greater number of students that meet the sort of standard for learning, then they get merit pay. So there is a technical sort of reason that teachers want to make sure all students can learn to a baseline, but that's the baseline. And then there's the support for students to learn at a much higher level. And those who learn to the baseline often actually drop out before they continue on to the final years of secondary school. So that's to answer those belief questions.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much, Joan.
Yeah.
Do you want to come in with?
Yeah, and I can also come in a little bit on the Indonesia question, because I was fortunate enough to visit our RISE Indonesia colleagues and to see them presenting these to top bureaucrats, to people who work closely with the minister. And I can say that Indonesia is very fortunate at the moment. As a Malaysian, I'm very jealous because they're our next door neighbor, that they have a reformist government in place at the moment who is listening and is trying to change things as much as possible. But I think one thing that I really respect about our Indonesia team, related to what Joan and Cynthia have said, I think, is that, Joan and Soufia have said, is they don't just depend on sort of the arbitrariness of that political economy, but they try to foster dialogue. They try to involve people who've been in the system longer. So, for example, our RISE Indonesia colleagues at the SMERU Research Institute, they write for the Conversation Indonesia. They regularly held dissemination events to civil society people, to teachers. And I believe one of them told me that at one of these events, one of the teachers said, "Thank you for your research. It made me feel like I was seen and heard," for the first time that my experience was to take into account. And that's such an important piece to have on the table in terms of dialogue. And diverging slightly still in terms of, has this been presented to people and how they're receptive? So I saw a question from Bram Fleisch about how I think teacher unions would respond to this whole curation thing. And I think that's obviously a very tricky question, but one piece I did want to get on the table about that is that there are many different types of organizations that are all called teacher unions. To give an overused archetypal example, part of my work during my PhD was with teachers in Finland. And in Finland, sure, the union does do salary negotiations at the national level, but it will also When there's a new curriculum, it'll help teachers interpret what this means for their subject. It also has a code of ethics. And that's a very different kind of union from the kind of union, for example, that in the second half of this webinar, we'll be launching a project where in one of those interviews, a colleague from Uganda, who was the deputy secretary in the union, then said she wanted trouble persuading the national level leaders of the union to be involved in a project that related to teaching and educational quality more generally, because they said, no, like our core work is about teachers' bread and butter. So, salary and teacher well-being. So the union was about teachers rather than about teaching. And I know actually in the context of the US, I believe Jal Mehta writes about this a little bit in the Allure Order about how teaching in the US professionalized around a union industrial model rather than a professional association model. Anyway, that's all a bit of a tangent. And I know it's a bit of a cop-out answer for me, but basically I acknowledge that it's a hard sell, but also that I think there'll be a lot of variation in what this means to unions in different countries, depending on the model along which they professionalize, and also, of course, depending on like the wider labor market structure. Not a full answer, but back to Michelle.
No, that's great. Thanks everyone. And thanks for the lively Q&A section here for everyone who's posting questions. Just a note to say, we're going to get through as many as we can. We clearly aren't going to be able to cover all the questions and comments here live, but we will capture them all and share them with the presenters. So there will be an opportunity for follow-up via email and other discussion forums to come back to these. So with that said, let me pose a few more to the group. Two that I think are posed pretty much to the panel overall, and then Yue-Yi, I've pulled together a few that are specific to the curate presentation that you gave that I'll let you kind of group and address in a grouping there. So the first for all the panelists is, to what extent has your research included the school leadership role, such as the role of the principal, and their importance in teachers' support and quality education? Could you elaborate on that? And then a second is a question from Halsey Rogers on I think this point about trade-offs, which comes into so much of this, right? Where on one hand, many of the reforms you're recommending are complementary, so you need to introduce multiple reforms at once to shift the equilibrium. But on the other hand, ministries often have very limited capacity, so you need to keep reforms simple to have any chance of implementing. How do you manage this? What have you seen from your research about how to manage this? Is there a minimum package of reforms that need to be introduced at once? And maybe how does this speak to issues of, is there an issue of prioritization or how to prioritize or even maybe sequence reforms in a meaningful way? And then Yue, a few grouped ones for you on the curation point. So one is, how do you, that I think are all somewhat, interrelated. So how do you measure this curation process? Unlike, say, a chartered accountant exam, a simple exam can't measure teacher success in a classroom. And so how would you measure success to determine curation? Another one on what percent of teachers should be curated out. The graph looks like 50%, but by what process and what criteria do you fire people is how the question is posed. But I think maybe that's a chance for you to clarify as well, that it's not always so much the system. It's also, as I think you were pointing to in your presentation, opportunity for teachers who have realized it's not a good fit for them to choose to exit the profession as well. So maybe you can clarify and discuss that. And then finally, a third one that again is all related. How do you see systems handling curation when they do not have enough teachers as it is? Where do you see the role of curation in the context with too few teachers? With that, I will turn it back over. Maybe Jacobus, to you first.
Right. I mean, a lot of his questions weren't targeted at me.
Just for the first few, and I think they were overarching, so you can pick and choose, how you address them, what parts of them are relevant from your research. But I think the points on prioritization ties in with the types of trainings that teachers need and the coaching and support.
I'm going to be a politician. I'm going to pivot to the work that I do know that I can talk about in these questions as well. And there was there was one question that came up about, research I've done on virtual versus in-person coaching, just thinking about the modalities that could be effective. And we found in South Africa that it was completely ineffective, the virtual coaching compared to in-person coaching, which does not mean it cannot be effective, and technology can play an important role. But I think this feedback that teachers can give in observing teaching and giving them targeted feedback is key, and that's very hard to do if you can't actually see what the teachers are doing. And that relationship also that can be built between the teacher and the coaches is really important, and I think that's something that is hard to do virtually. And it also links to the question somebody asked about, can coaching and mentoring sustain patriarchy in these systems? I do think an equal relationship and a non-hierarchical relationship is key, and often these inspectors and government agents who come visit schools play a more kind of police enforcer role, which could undermine the kind of teachers' willingness and ability to admit weakness and sincerely discuss ways to improve. And so I think it is a cultural shift also that is required. I'll just point about prioritization. It's so deep and difficult. I can't give a good answer, but of course, if you have somebody who is really, I mean, the Ceará province in Brazil, when they did a mix of multiple different types of interventions at the same time, but both at prioritizing learning, but also supporting teachers, where you need both. And that was a very reform-minded individual who had the long-term view and a lot of political capital. And so you are right. I think it's very hard to get all of these things done at the same time, when the gains will be observed only much later without a leadership that really does care about it inherently. Sorry, that was just jumping around based on the questions.
That's okay. You're allowed. Panelist prerogative. Great. Okay. How about we just go around? And so Yue-Yi, come to you next, and then Joan, and then Soufia.
Yeah. I'll try to blast through those questions about the curation thing. And again, I know it's a complicated question. First, on how, if we accept that, we need to curate, we need to let teachers find a match through some time of engagement and practice, how do we judge them in that engagement and practice? Part of that answer is that, like Michelle said, ideally, aspirationally, we think that we would like high professional standards such that if teachers see a mismatch themselves, then they voluntarily leave. Of course, that depends on so many other things. Oh, sorry, I'm mixing the second question in there. But in terms of how to judge specifically, one thing that I mentioned in passing the presentation is that teaching is complex, right? And that means that what makes a good teacher can be hard to measure in standardized metrics, but we do actually have, there's quite a lot of research suggesting that it's much more possible to determine this in sort of what we call thick in-person engagement. So 2 studies from Pakistan, I think, are particularly interesting. One is by Natalie Bao and Jishnu Das, where they looked at panel data, and they found that there was no correlation between standardized measures, including teachers' pedagogical content knowledge, I believe, and how much their students learn. But in private schools, the teachers who are helping kids learn more actually were being compensated better by their school. So meaning their better performance was being recognized. And I'm not saying that performance-based pay is the way to go, but that just indicates that it's possible for people on the ground to really see who is making a real difference to children. Another interesting study from Pakistan was a randomized control trial, a head-to-head of objective versus subjective measures of teacher performance, objective being a teacher value added kind of measure, subjective being a grade that was assigned by the head teacher. And this was a study by Tahir Andrabi and Christina Brown. And they found that I think that the causal relationship, so the incentive-based scheme on the subjective measure was as effective as an incentive-based scheme on the objective test score-based measure but the subjective measure actually had fewer negative side effects for, say, classroom climate, for teacher-student relationships that the objective one had. So this is to say, even though opening the door for non-standardized measurement can be scary in some ways, especially when you're talking about like system-wide government provision, we do have evidence suggesting that in something as complex and as relational as classroom teaching, opening that door to subjectivity can be valuable. And then again, on the percentage question, which I started answering a little bit when I got jumbled just now. Unfortunately, I really think the answer is that it depends. And that graph was roughly 50%. I concede that that was both a little bit for a dramatic effect and both a little bit because Lat, my co-author, being a development economist, has maybe slightly more stringent views on this than I do. And he was originating this in a context where maybe that did make sense. But I truly mean that it depends. And this is partly because it also depends on things like wider labor market structures, where in some settings, in some developed countries that have high professional standards, maybe it's much easier for teachers to say retrain in higher education if they want to shift professions. It's much easier to say do shift to even more lucrative private tutoring if you decide you don't actually care about classroom teaching that much anymore, but just want to use your skills. That's not a reality in many other settings. And all of those dynamics play into what curation should look like. Finally, also relatedly on the point about like curation, like how can you advocate for this when there are teacher shortages? I think this is partly a long game, short game kind of question. The aspiration was putting something like curation into place is that in the long term, it will raise professional standards such that it will become a desirable profession. Of course, it's easy for me to say as a researcher doing synthesis work. It's much harder for a politician to say, but that is answer. I'll leave that because I know we are running short of time, but thanks.
Great, thanks, Yue-Yi. Go ahead, Joan.
So I think I'll take up the question a little bit. I have a couple of them I'll take up, but the around principle and leadership, and just say I don't really have definitive answers for you yet because it is something that we have. As I said, we did interview all the principals. We actually also collected the DWMS, which is the Development Management Survey, World Management Survey on principles at our primary and our secondary level. So we have a lot of data, but we have not yet analyzed it to look at the effects of principles. I would say, yes, we know it matters, but principals are even more politicized in some ways than teachers, right? If we talk about them as civil servants. And so they're, as I was saying in our analysis, they're a little less engaged. They do get some training, but they aren't as engaged. And therefore they can't always support teachers to really develop a craft and a commitment to teaching, I think. I was thinking back as I was going to answer this of, almost 15 years ago, I worked on a project of principal development in Uganda because we knew that that really mattered to actually support teachers in teaching. We didn't look at the outcomes of that on learning outcomes per se, but we did actually try to support the principal leadership component, and teachers find that really, really helpful to their own teaching. So all that is to say, there's much more to be analyzed around principles and leaderships, at least in our Vietnam data. That said, what we have analyzed, at least quantitatively, and they have included a number of the variables from the principal data set. What we are seeing is that the teacher pedagogy matters most in terms of learning and learning outcomes, so not just in Vietnam. But I wanted to bring up one other point that hasn't been talked about as much, but I think one thing that's overlooked a lot is actually what goes on in teacher training. So we talk about like in-service or pre-service and whether it matters or coaching matters versus pre-service or in-service, but we don't always really look at what actually happens. And again, we were sort of not remiss in this in our Vietnam study because we intended to do it. But we sort of ran out of time and some money, and then we did go back and actually gather some data from teacher educators, particularly around the competency-based reform, and had intended to work with them on giving them actual videos of teacher practices to be able to use that in improving their teacher education. So I just want to call that point out, that I think is an important area that we overlook. There is a question about assessment and whether and how that interacts with reforms. I don't know if we want to take that up later or if you want us to answer it now.
why don't we give Soufia a chance to respond thus far, and then we'll see if we have time for one last kind of quick comment for everyone.
So Michelle, there are two questions. I remember the second one better than the first. The second one was about prioritizing reforms, but what was the first one again? Was it the researcher's role in supporting ministries?
The first was on the school leadership role and the role of principals and school leadership in the interactions with teachers.
Okay, I'm just going to kind of take the first one and nestle it within the second, because it's part of some ideas that I've played with in my head and some things that we've seen work in the Pakistani context, at least in terms of prioritizing reforms. It's a really difficult question. I don't think anyone would say, here's how we can do it, but we could brainstorm a few principles for practice. Especially, it's an exercise that I think, especially in developing country contexts, it's a really important one, because the standard response to any big change that gets proposed is, I think we just don't have money this year, and we may not have it for the next 2 years either. So just, kind of keep that thought to yourself is what you're being told. And I think the way around it is to, first of all, figure out the pain points in the system based on the research that one has been able to do, to figure out, like, who are the actors, what are some of the dynamics that are shaping the way that they position themselves in the system, and then how either people above them in the accountability chain would position them, and how people below them, so subordinates, how they look at them as well. And once you have that kind of stakeholder mapping process laid out, then you start to see a lot more of the forces that are factoring into one person's potential response or behavior. And then you can brainstorm which forces might be relatively easier to navigate or work with, and who might be more responsive based on either what part of the political cycle you're in, so that's the election cycle, or based on where their commitments really lie. And as a simple example, let's say that the number one problem, and we saw it in the Indonesia presentation, we see it all the time in Pakistan, and I think it's true for a lot of other country contexts as well, where the rules aren't laid out very clearly for how you are both a public servant but also a teacher. We see teachers in Pakistan spending a lot of time doing non-teaching and even non-educational activities. And we've experimented with this in the Punjab and didn't really get to fully roll it out, but just sharing some thoughts from it. So for instance, like there's a school enrollment drive that happens at the beginning of every school year. And that's something that teachers end up doing themselves. If you strengthen local government, and if you activated bodies at the community level, especially those who are retired or young people who are either on a gap year or have time to volunteer, that's the kind of activity that they could be mobilized to participate in instead. And it's not groundbreaking stuff. It's really not even that difficult. You do it all the time for like trash collection activities and other community services. It's something that you could do to reach out to neighborhoods and help them understand why it's important for their kids to be in school, and to also guide the parents through that process. But it would open up a whole lot of time for teachers to focus either on lesson planning or other activities that they have to focus on as part of their professional responsibilities as a teacher. So that's one example. The other thing I was thinking about kind of bringing up was, think about how many moves need to be made so before you can actually lead to an impactful change. And one example is in the slides that I showed earlier, I was referring to how we need to use the data more effectively for KP government. And just a quick example before I wrap up. So right now there's already, two kinds of surveys that are conducted by the Directorate for Curriculum and Teacher Education. And they've built up like a huge data set, but the problem is that they don't disaggregate it at the right level. So they have data at that level. It's just that nobody sits there to clean it up at that level. And part of the trouble is with their sampling strategy. So this isn't something that needs extra hires. The people who sit in the directorate already have these skills. It's literally that nobody has sat down with them and helped them understand that if you tweak the levels at which you collect data, and if you tweak just 2 variables in your existing survey and develop your sampling strategy in a different way, you could be disaggregating data at multiple levels, which can result in more targeted professional development suited to localized needs. So I think that's the kind of work that researchers can be especially helpful in doing. And it's not something that people would respond to immediately, but if you meet people halfway and tell them, you're doing a great job, and your data is immensely important, except the one small problem is the reason that we can't feed the whole data set back into this loop of improving the teacher experience is because you don't collect this one particular variable at this level. So how about we try that next time as a pilot and see where it goes? And that's something that I'm personally trying to work on with the department. So I thought I would share that experience. But I hope that these are 2 ways in which it can get people thinking about how to prioritize reforms, go for what's traditionally called the lowest hanging fruit. And I think the lowest hanging fruit is one in which you don't have to spend a lot of money and you don't have to fight huge battles with the entire system, but it can be the use of technology. It can be just an additional data point that is incorporated into an existing set or survey. Or it could just be talking to a few additional people and helping them understand that you're not opposed to their work and you're not trying to take their credit away from them, but in fact that if they kind of support what you're suggesting, it can bolster their presence both in their department and also in the annual civil service reviews that will be used eventually to evaluate them. So those were some of my thoughts. I hope they're a little bit useful.
Great. Thanks so much, Soufia, and thanks everyone for leaving us with those remarks. So this has been a great session. We are going to go ahead and wrap up ahead of the break between the 2 parts. So I want to say on behalf of all the participants of the webinar, a big thank you to the panelists. Thanks for sharing about your research, but also some of these kind of bigger picture and practical reflections on what you see coming out of the research. I think it's been a really rich discussion. We can see that from the Q&A as well. So just a reminder, we will go ahead and capture those Q&A and create an opportunity for ongoing conversations as well. With that, I'm going to invite the panelists. You can turn off your videos if you want and ask Joe if he could just put up our transition slide, and I'll give just a little quick reminder about where we are in our 2-part webinar. Oh yes, so first, so just a reminder that we have our messaging campaign happening right now that this is a part of, with teaching as the focus of next week. So this is the prelude to that. And go ahead, Joe, to the next one. Perfect. And then, so we'll take a 10-minute break now. I believe this link will stay live. So if you're staying for part 2, you can just stay put and keep yourself on mute and go have a 10-minute break. We'll come back for part 2 on teacher norms and the launch of a new volume that we've just put out called Purpose, Pressures, and Possibilities, Conversations about Teacher Professional Norms in the Global South. And that will include some remarks as well as a roundtable discussion with some of the participants that contributed to that volume. So please do, if you can, stick around, and we'll come back at 35 past the hour for part 2. Thanks so much, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to part 2 of our Teachers and Teaching webinar today. So I will go ahead and kick things off, and I want to welcome back everyone who was with us for part 1 that we just concluded, and we're coming back from a 10-minute break for those of you who are with us for part 1. And I want to welcome those of you who are joining us just for this part 2. And so this part 2 of the webinar is on, there we go, thanks, on purpose, pressures, and possibilities, conversations about teacher professional norms in the Global South. And we're launching a new volume that my colleague Yue-Yi has been leading the charge on for many months now. So we're very excited to be launching it today. Joe, can you go ahead and go to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so just for those of you who have just joined, just a note that we're in the midst of a messaging campaign that's distilling and disseminating policy messages that have emerged from RISE research. And today's webinars are a part of the supporting teaching theme, while the teacher norms, which we'll be focused on here in part 2, are particularly and also tightly linked to the themes earlier in the campaign of commitment and alignment in education systems. And so moving on to this part of the webinar. Great. So like I said, this is part 2 of the webinar and is launching this new volume edited by my colleague Yue-Yi, which included interview transcripts and discussant essays for more than 28 individuals altogether. The volume is a really impressive undertaking and an outstanding contribution to our understanding of teacher norms and their role in education system transformation and learning outcomes. The webinar itself has a unique format, so I'm going to give just this quick overview so you know what to expect. And I'm going to introduce 2 of our speakers now and then the discussants in a moment. So first, we'll hear an introduction from Yue-Yi, who is the RISE research manager at the University of Oxford, who is going to describe the project that led up to this volume and the launch today. And then Yue-Yi is going to facilitate a roundtable discussion with 5 of the individuals who were involved in the project. And then finally, to close things out, I want to go ahead and introduce now at the top that we'll be hearing closing remarks from Barbara Bruns, who is a non-resident fellow with the Center for Global Development and a member of the RISE intellectual leadership team. So she'll be sharing reflections from her extensive work on these topics with us and share some forward-looking thoughts on where we go from here. So with that, I'll go ahead and let Yue-Yi give us an overview of the project, and then I'll introduce the discussant participants right before we launch into the roundtable discussion. So Yue-Yi, over to you.
Great. Let's see if I can get my slides up without issue this time. I think that's the right one. Does that look right? Okay.
Looks great. Yep.
Wonderful. So I am so happy to tell you all about this project, which, as Michelle said, is titled Purpose, Pressures, and Possibilities, Conversations about Teacher Professional Norms in the Global South. And as you might have seen during the break, this whole book is now freely available as a PDF at that link, so bit.ly/teacher norms. And to give you an overview of the conversations about teacher professional norms that we have in this book. So it starts with a forward from Nat Pritchett, our RISE research director, then there's an introduction from me. Then we get to the exciting bit, which is edited transcripts from interviews with 14 pairs of interlocutors. And each pair of interlocutors had experience related to teacher professional norms that was in some way complementary. So maybe one was an academic, they were both academics, but they were from different disciplines and different country contexts, or someone was from a teachers union and someone was from an intergovernmental organization, or someone was from an educational network speaking to someone from a public management background. And a few of the interlocutors, actually, people spoke in part 1 of this webinar. So we saw Joan DeJaeghere, Cynthia Revina, and Soufia Siddiqi. And you'll hear from some of the interlocutors in this part of the webinar at the roundtable. And I had a roughly hour-long interview with each pair. And then after that, then what we did was the interlocutors were free to reflectively revise the interview transcripts as much as they wanted to. Right, and then we also added in these side note references next to the transcript so that interlocutors were indirectly in conversation, both with the research literature and with people from other interviews. And then we have 3 discussant style essays to wrap up, including one from Barbara Bruns, who, as Michelle mentioned, will be giving us closing remarks today. So do check out the book and continue the conversation on your own platforms. But for the rest of this overview presentation, I just wanted to give a little bit of a sense of, why I think teacher norms are so interesting and so important, and why this project is called Purpose, Pressures, and Possibilities. And to do both of those, I'm going to use a framework, which is the basis of how I analyze the interviews. So in this framework, there are 4 domains, 3 of which are framed from the perspective of the teacher. So the selves, or what I value, that's the blue. Situations, or what can be done in my classroom and school, that's green. Standards, or what the ministry or my head teacher or highly mobilized parents or other influential people expect of me, that's the, magenta or whatever that is. And then all these 3 domains fall within the broader domain of society. And for the purposes of this project, I define teacher norms as dominant beliefs among teachers about what most teachers will practice and prioritize in a given context. And my sort of broad hypothesis is that these dominant beliefs or norms are most likely to emerge where factors from different domains end up pushing in the same direction. So those shaded bits you see at intersections. Anyway, so I know that was all quite abstract. So I'm going to give an example with interview quotes from Bilal Hagos, who will be on our roundtable later. And Bilal here is talking about what he called a teacher professional identity crisis in Ethiopia, which I think is an example of what it looks like when the purpose of the teaching profession has really unfortunately been eroded by various pressures. So starting with society, there's the fact that teaching used to be a respected profession, but that's no longer the case. And then, oops, sorry, I went too far. Oh no, I did not go too far. And then, right, so after society, then there's standards. So the ministry has taken away recruitment standards, which relate to the craft of teaching, so that it has contributed to teaching unfortunately becoming a profession of last resort. And then another group of those in charge, the politicians, what they care about is the visible appearance of education, not whether children are actually getting educated or not. And then one example of something that isn't very visible but matters a lot for education and the teaching profession is induction for novice teachers, which is often neglected. So this affects teachers' perspectives on what can and can't be done in their school and classroom situations, with further limitations in the situation coming from the fact that teaching is not a desirable and respected profession. So this contributes to teachers not having the capacity that they need. And all of this means that it's unsurprising that teachers feel the profession isn't all that rewarding, and that the rewards that are available are really just financial and don't have much to do actually with teaching or with professional purpose. So given the eroded professionalism, the lack of intrinsic motivations, etc., it's again unsurprising that for many teachers, showing up and actually teaching is not something they necessarily prioritize. It falls outside of their selves or what teachers value. So that's one norm. And another norm is that teachers are likely to leave the profession because the profession has lost a lot of its meaning, right? There isn't a shared sense of professing a shared vision of what it means to be a teacher, right? So that's one example of how factors across teacher selves and situations and standards in society can interact with teacher norms. But I'm going to give quickly a second example that might be familiar to some people in this webinar. So where this blue line, which represents the progression that's expected in curricular standards, grade by grade, covers far more content than what the education system has actually prepared children to learn, where the red line is children's average mastery of curricular content. And this means that, many kids are far behind the curriculum through no fault of their own. And one thing that was clear across these teacher norms interviews is that this phenomenon isn't just about curriculum, but it's about intertwined factors across different domains. And I've mapped these here, so I know this is a bit more complicated. It's pooling across various interviews as well as some other research sources, and there's a lot going on here. So I'm just going to zero in on a couple of parts, and I'll bring back snippets from Svetlana Sabarwal's interview quotes as I go along. So first, there's the societal beliefs about what we should care about in terms of learning, which often gets equated with exam toppers or how many kids got straight A's and so on. And the societal perception can be traced in other domains. So for example, in standards, it means that what those in charge expect is good pass rates on the exit exam. And it also means that what teachers themselves value might reflect this belief that what matters most in learning is the achievement as the highest performing children. So the upshot of all of this is that one thing that's very likely to be done in blue is that teaching that serves the most advantaged children who have the highest chances of getting good exam scores, right? Rather than teaching that helps all children to flourish. And one thing that's likely to be done superficially in pink is covering the curriculum, because the curriculum is often covered superficially in a rote way that serves exam prep rather than real understanding and mastery. Right, so these are just some examples of the pressures that can erode the sense of purpose that deserves to be at the heart of the teaching profession. But I didn't want to end there because this book is called Purpose, Pressures, and Possibilities. And the conversations in this volume also point to lots of possibilities for how we can move forward. And what you see on the screen is just a small selection of the possibilities discussed in this book. So to end with the words of one of our interlocutors, Kak Lehil Sangadi, she says, "We still have a very long way to go, but I have hope. Sometimes things are not moving as quickly as we would have expected or wanted, but we are moving." And I think that's the most important thing. So on that note, thank you very much. Do check out the book. I'm so looking forward to the roundtable and to Barbara's remarks. And back to you, Michelle.
Great. Thanks so much, Yue-Yi, for that great overview of the project and all the work that went into it. So, as I said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our discussants and then hand right back over to Yue-Yi to facilitate the roundtable discussion. And just a note on logistics ahead of this is that, as you'll see, the chat function and the Q&A function are available within this. Feel free to use the chat to chat, essentially, to raise comments, but for any questions that you actually want posed to the panel, please put that in the Q&A. That's what we will monitor for questions to pose as a part of the roundtable discussion. So with that, let me introduce our roundtable discussants. So first we have Barbara Tournier, who is program specialist at the International Institute for Educational Planning, IIEP, with UNESCO. We have Belay Hagos, who's associate professor of education at Addis Ababa University, and who is a member of the RISE Ethiopia team. We have Joaquin Walker, who is executive director at Elige Educar in Chile. We have Laura Savage, executive director at the International Education Funders Group. And finally, Yamini Iyer, who's president and chief executive at the Center for Policy Research in India, and has also been a collaborator with the RISE Political Economy of Implementation team. So welcome to you all. We're all really looking forward to the discussion. And as I said, I'll hand right back over to Yue-Yi, who's going to lead and facilitate the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. So these 5 wonderful panelists that Michelle just introduced and that we have on this roundtable were all interlocutors in a paired interview on the Teacher Norms Project. Or in Joaquin's case, he's representing his colleague, Veronica Cabezas, who was an interlocutor. I should also say, I noticed in the chat that we have another interlocutor present, Maria Teresa Tato. Thank you so much for joining, Maria Teresa. Unfortunately, I did not have confidence in my ability to lead a roundtable of more than 5 people. So that's where we're at. Right, so the aspiration for this roundtable is to get really conversational and to really engage with many of the issues and questions related to teacher norms. And we saw in part 1 of the webinar that there are a lot of issues and a lot of questions. So speakers are encouraged to, respond to each other, to ask each other questions. Also, given that there are 5 of you, I'd like to encourage also panelists to be brief. And the way this is going to work is that I'm going to start with a prompt and each speaker will respond to this prompt, taking 2 to 3 minutes to do so. Then panelists, you're free to engage with each other. I'm hoping for a free-flowing discussion. I just plan to come in occasionally to bring in questions from the audience here and there. And again, as Michelle said, audience, do submit your questions through the Q&A function. Also, I might come in to prompt a specific panelist to contribute their perspective if I know they have a relevant one. And I also might come in to, unfortunately, encourage a panelist to wrap up quickly and give someone else the floor. Right, so that all said, so here's the prompt. So the prompt is, should we try to reorient teacher professional norms towards student learning? And could you share a brief story, example, or experience illustrating why you feel this way? So let's start with, I'm going to put Yamini on the spot. So 2 to 3 minutes, Yamini, and then we'll hand it off to someone else.
Thank you. First of all, let me congratulate you on what is such a fabulous compilation of research and ideas and conversations. It's really really fantastic, and I think it's going to come into. I was just thinking to myself, we were about to do a survey, and I feel like I don't think I'm ready to make my questionnaire before without reading through your volume. So many congratulations. This is really going to be a huge contributor to scholarly work on this issue. The short answer to your question is yes, but that's the easy answer. I think it's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more complicated in the following way. From the work that we did with teachers in Delhi, the challenge with reorienting norms is not that teachers, is that teachers themselves actually very deeply think about themselves very much as teachers, and in the particular focusing very much on improving learning for children. The challenge is in terms of how they define learning. It is defined within the confines of the context from which they come. So the societal beliefs that you spoke about, which are very much anchored in the ultimate goal of the education system being about maximizing your ability to do well in the examination, the teachers come from that world. They too have, in fact, achieved a lot to become teachers in that system. So at one level, they are doing precisely what they think they need to do, or they have, and coming from a system in which they've actually achieved quite a lot to be able to become teachers. So breaking this is not so much about reorienting them towards learning per se. I think it's about reorienting them towards different transition paths towards achieving learning. And what does that mean? And we'll never be able to wish away the examination. I mean, unless we think of learning of the school system in a completely radically different way, which I'm not sure we're talking about in this particular context, the examination will always be an important marker of what happens in the classroom. The question is, how do you bring the child to a place where they become exam ready? Do you bring them by rote learning and maximizing the syllabus and therefore pushing the classroom to and the teacher to just focus on the first 3 rows? Or do you bring the teacher there through bring the child there and the teacher there through a different path? The second, and I'll say this very quickly because I think it may or may not be very unique to Indian bureaucracy.
Can I actually ask you to pause for a minute, and then I'm going to bring someone else into the conversation and come back to you. Your stories are all so fascinating, but balance. Can I ask Barbara Tony to go next, please? And then maybe Bilal after that. So Bilal, get ready.
Thanks, Yue-Yi. I'd also like to echo Yamini's words on the great book, and I really look forward to reading all of it. So the question that you asked is obviously a little bit controversial because it kind of implies that professional norms are not necessarily oriented towards student learning, or in any case, not enough. So obviously this will vary on the context, but I would also tend to agree with the statement, and it's always easy to critique because we can always do better, but nonetheless, there are issues with the way education systems are run and that need to be addressed. And so I'll give a few examples because we were encouraged to draw on examples, so to make it more lively. So the first example I'd like to refer to is from a visit to a country in East Africa, and the teachers were telling me about how they were really working in difficult circumstances. But what was really demotivating for them was the sense of injustice, because there were no prerequisites to become a head teacher or to get a promotion into administration. So someone who had very little experience, but who had political connections could be appointed. And that was really demotivating. And so there were no standards and minimum requirements for positions of responsibility. So that is really not oriented towards student learning. And also there was this political interference, which was creating distrust in the system. So, and then similarly, if you look at levels higher up above the schools, so IIP has been doing some studies on decentralization, and there's one that I really liked, and we looked at a West African country, and you could see that people in district offices didn't really necessarily have the right profiles or qualifications to be in those positions of responsibility. And in 2 districts with the same number of teachers, one had twice the amount of staff as the other. So clearly that was not efficient, and again, not conducive to really professionalizing the education system and really gearing it towards student learning. So I guess what I'm saying is you have to be serious about education, and you want to have a continuum of professionalization from the school level right the way up to the top, because I found there's been a lot of emphasis and put on teachers and monitoring of teachers' work, but it hasn't followed through to necessarily to the other levels. But we need to change that and really make sure that education systems are running efficiently at all levels, and the different levels speak to one another. Even if teachers are just what we see, they're just the visible part, we need to look at what's happening behind the scenes, and to really look at teaching as a collective endeavor.
Great, thanks so much, Barbara. So I'll go to Bilal now, and then I think we'll do Joaquin next, and Laura, you'll round us out. Is that all right?
Thank you very much. I also congratulate you for producing this valuable book. For the question, my answer is yes. But we have to also see the context of learning, the context of being a teacher in Ethiopia, for instance. So I will very briefly describe what that context looks like so that I can suggest the how can we achieve this. So in terms of learning, Ethiopia has a remarkable achievement in terms of school enrollment and number of teachers increasing over the last 20 years. But in terms of learning has become very low and declining over the last 20 years. We have the data from the government already recorded. So as an example, for grade 2 students, which was conducted a learning assessment in 2021, 70% of grade 2 students were found to be zero readers. So they could not read, 70%, and that is shocking finding. And this was less than what happened in the previous years. So there was a declining trend. So learning is declining. So what happened in terms of teacher context? Well, the Ministry of Education data tells us that less than 30% of the teacher population are qualified for the position. So about 70% or more are not qualified for the position. They need more training, it means. And the other is on the engagement part. Teacher engagement was studied by the study commissioned by the World Bank in Ethiopia, and about 47% of the teachers are not engaged in teaching in the school. So this has also an impact on the student learning outcome. And respect for the teaching position has also declined, partly because the selection process for teachers is not demanding, it's not competitive position. So those students with low scores are applying for a teaching position, which makes the teaching position less respected. And in fact, when they are hired, they know they will be hired for life. They will not be fired even if they don't have any impact on learning. So I can answer that question, yes, we can, in two ways. Number one, if the governments or the political leadership has the will to change, then the change will be transforming teacher education. Teacher education has to be transformed. There should be teacher education system overhaul in the country, where the focus will be on early learning, because that is a foundation. So that's number one. Number two, we have
very quick with number two.
Yeah. Shall I stop here?
I know, you can just give it to us in one sentence and then we'll go to Joaquin.
Yes, one sentence, yeah. Number two is building the capacity of the existing teachers, because there is a huge competence gap, because many of them are not qualified for the position. Yeah, thank you. Back to you. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Yue-Yi, for this invitation, and congratulations for this amazing work. It has been fascinating to read all these experiences, and thank you for gathering us here. So I would like to answer this question from our experience from Elige Educar. Elige Educar means choose teaching, and we invite high-performing students finishing high school to study teaching career programs and to become teachers in order to have the best possible candidates to become teachers. So we've been studying how young generations perceive the teaching profession and how they perceive the norms in the teaching profession. And yes, we believe that these norms should be reoriented towards learning, but also young generations, without saying it with these same words, also perceive that. And young generations, in some studies that we've developed, perceive that teachers don't have the autonomy needed and the capacity to decide their own pedagogical decisions. And they are trapped so many times, not always, of course, in a too strong framework that says what they have to do. A very prospective curriculum, strong accountability, and a very individualistic profession that doesn't contribute to deliberate with others and to create. And young generations, they want more flexibility in their work. They want to create, they want to innovate. They don't want to just apply what it is done by others. So in order to move the teaching profession towards learning, we need to give teachers the capacity, we need to trust in teachers to help them to make their own pedagogical decisions, of course, within a certain framework, because we need to guarantee certain quality, certain standards, and that's a challenge. Okay, yes, it's very easy to say, yes, we want autonomy, but autonomy within certain framework. So not just because of the in order to improve the teaching profession, but also because we want to make this profession more attractive to younger generations, we need to strengthen autonomy, and this will also help at the end the learning of students, because teachers will be also making better pedagogical decisions.
Great. Thanks so much, Joaquin. So we're going to go to Laura to round out this initial prompt. After this is mentioned, we're going to try to go to a free-flowing discussion. And audience, as a note, feel free to put in questions that you have for the roundtable in the Q&A at any point. Laura, all yours.
Thank you. And I tried really hard to say no to this. It's always nice when you get a controversial prompt to say the opposite of what you're expected to say, right? And I guess I anticipated everyone would say yes, but so trying not to be that, the closest I could get was maybe not. So maybe we shouldn't try to reorientate teacher professional norms towards student learning. And why do I say that? Because, right, we've just heard, you know, a lot of, not only in this session, but also I think in the previous session, a huge amount of evidence, and we've all got our own experience that says how essential teacher beliefs, teacher motivation, teacher incentives are to student learning, right? So, you know, I myself have felt for the last few years that there's a teacher crisis lying behind the global learning crisis, and I've been engaged a lot at the kind of global policy level conversations. And it's not sufficiently addressed, and it feels incredibly complex and daunting. I mean, almost every aspect of every teacher-related reform we've talked about today sounds so difficult. So why am I saying maybe not? And I say maybe not because I think in some contexts, the idea that we should reorient teacher professional norms, it depends who the we is, right? And it depends, is that we going to come across as ownership, as telling them what to do, as unintended consequences? And I think back, I mean, the example I guess I think of is a good few years ago now when I worked in Bangladesh with the local education group. And I was representing, you know, there were kind of 9 or 10 different funders, and we had a payment by delivery model where the international funders released funding to the government based on a series of 9 different indicators. And one of those 9 was to implement ability-based learning in classrooms and move away from rote learning and rote teaching. And, you know, it took some time. We couldn't use BRAC as an example because the government, of course, wouldn't, you know, take an example from BRAC. So we took an example from elsewhere, and there was a huge amount of kind of evidence and study tours, and, you know, the bureaucrats and the government senior officials were super on board with the idea that we would pilot in only 300 schools of BRAC's many, many schools, an effort to move away from rote pedagogy. And that got all the way into implementation, and the parents kicked back. Absolutely not. We do not agree with this whole reform. They had not been engaged sufficiently in the consultation. And they were asking, well, why isn't my kid coming home and repeating the things that I expect them to repeat? So, you know, there was a major blockage. The reform failed. We couldn't use the word reform because that would indicate what had been tried before was also not acceptable. And so the whole thing fell apart, and the donors were left in a difficult space of, well, do we release the funding or not? Whose fault is it? Who are we? So I think my caution here is, you know, yes, of course, in theory and in so many places in practice, we should be looking at teacher professional norms and trying to change them. But we need to all the time be thinking not only of who we are to be,
oh dear. Laura, are you there? Okay, Laura has cut out a moment, but Laura, if you can hear us, I just completely agree that these questions about agency and power dynamics and whose priorities are so tremendously important. And I struggle with them a lot as well, right? I mean, in some ways, I'm like, oh, I'm a teacher from a developing country, but Malaysia's upper middle income. I was a teacher for 2 years through a Teach For program. I now am based in the UK. What right do I have to tell any teacher what? But anyway, which is partly why one aspiration of this volume was to bring different voices from different settings. Not as many people actually in the volume are people teaching experiences I would have wanted, my fault entirely. But yeah, having these conversations, to go back to a term Joan used in the first panel, deliberative discussions, I think is so important. Okay, so we're going to shift to the free-flowing discussion part. I'm going to bring in one question for the audience, but also just panelists feel free to riff. We can maybe start with Yamini because I cut you off just now, Yamini. But just to feed the conversation, then I'm going to mute myself. There's a question from Claire Buntic. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. Has there been any analysis of teacher autonomy versus accountability for learning outcomes? And I think a bit more broadly than that, how does the balance of autonomy and accountability influence teacher norms? So we'll start with Yamini, then just ask each other questions, go for it.
Thank you. Let me give the example of a classroom in India, which I think will resonate with so much of what everybody has been saying. A typical day in a school in Delhi, where we did a bulk of our field work, but I think it extends to many other parts of the country, begins with the head teacher, the headmaster of the school, walking into the head teacher's room, and there are two data entry operators, and they put on their computer to log into the management information system to check out what the circular of the day, the government order of the day has in store for them. And that shapes the first conversation they have with the teachers about what is priority. And 9 out of 10 times, what is priority is not what the teachers are teaching inside the classroom, or more importantly, the level at which children are and what challenges teachers might be confronting in the classroom. It is very much about a set of administrative tasks that are essential to keeping the form of the school system functioning. And those administrative tasks have been delegated from the top of the Directorate of Education all the way down into the school. We just sent out a letter to the Directorate of Education to allow our surveyors to do pilots of a survey we want to do in schools. I presume over the next few days, once the file moves various desks, when the teachers walk in one morning, their day is going to be preoccupied with downloading the circular about us and then preparing themselves for us showing up yet another administrative task that's taking the teacher away from the classroom. So, to the broad question about accountability, there is far more accountability demand within the system for the administrative tasks that keep the education system going than there is accountability demand for what's actually happening inside the classroom. And part of the challenge there is when accountability is demanded for what is happening inside the classroom, it inevitably translates itself into the language that the system recognizes, which is the language of orders, the language of processes. So it is about syllabus completion. It is about number of children that have passed the examination. It's much harder to convert a complex conversation about competencies, learning pathways, challenges teachers might be facing within the classroom into orders, checklists that are easy for an administrative system to process. Now, but within that, there's another challenge because somebody spoke about autonomy, and this whole question of pedagogical choices came up a few times in the conversation too. And that's sort of where my own discomfort with the easy answer of reorienting teacher norms towards student learning outcomes comes in, which is that the pedagogical construct of the classroom has been very much shaped by the idea of the syllabus, which gives a framework, the curriculum, which gives a set of rules, the syllabus, which gives a framework, and then the examination, which gives you a clear sense of how you measure the outcome. So the teacher's operating within that context. And in fact, society is sort of expecting the classroom to function in that way. In our work in Delhi, one of the most visible experiences we had of this was when parents walked into the head teacher's room very upset with the school because they had undertaken an assessment to judge learning levels of children, and parents were and then sort of reorient the classroom to children's learning levels, and parents were like, how can you test our child without telling us in advance? When the child has to prepare, an examination is a process, a test is an examination, is a process that has to be taken seriously. We all take it seriously. So it's not like the teacher isn't working towards learning outcomes. That is the outcome that the teacher understands. That is the outcome that is demanded of the administrative process. But most importantly, that is the outcome that is being demanded of parents. And parents are not wrong in demanding this either. It is the most tangible way of understanding where children are within the expectations of what we have of the learning system. I think the challenge is, how do you translate into an understanding the process through which the examination result is actually achieved? That process is not about rote learning. That process is about a pathway of learning that a student in the classroom goes through. And it is actually a very interactive, dialectical process between the teacher and the child that needs to unfold. And I don't know that we have a good language, both for parents and for teachers, and indeed for children, to be able to arrive at what that is. So autonomy in the classroom becomes a challenge. In Delhi, the case that we studied, there was a very clear attempt at giving autonomy to the teacher. So we reduce the syllabus, and teachers can teach to the level of the child. The phrase that was used was differential teaching. And teachers actually struggle with autonomy because they come from a particular imagination of what the classroom is supposed to be. So when this autonomy was given, they used the time that they had to revise the syllabus so that children will do better in the examination, rather than thinking about different ways of teaching and learning. So I think this is the sort of challenge that we have. I don't have good answers of how to move forward. But one thing I can say is autonomy isn't something that can be just handed over one day in a system that is very much designed to function within its own confines. Autonomy itself has to be nurtured, taught, and mentored into the education system. And we need to think through that a little harder as we move forward in this discourse.
May I jump in, Yue-Yi? So a concept that I like related to autonomy, which is in the words of someone you interviewed, is the concept of guided autonomy that mentions Sharad Jivan from Steer Education and Intrinsic Labs. So I think that's a great point. Yes, autonomy is needed by teachers, but that autonomy is within a framework which is not only the public framework, the public laws, the curriculum, but also the guidance of a leader, of leaders, or your peers, also. So yes, it's not just how to make your own decisions from nowhere, like absolute autonomy, but in a framework in which you receive also feedback. And sometimes the excess focus on accountability is like if you achieve or if you fail, but we don't get the most from what we learn from that process. And in that sense, leadership is hugely important to guide that autonomy and to learn constantly from others, your peers, and also school principals and others.
Just picking up on that point, one of the things that I've noticed really happening in the global debate recently is that we seem to be piling more and more into that framework, to that expectation, if we are talking about guided autonomy and the framework with which to guide teachers. I mean, there's all sorts of funders supporting all sorts of different activities to provide such framework for teachers, right? But we're piling more and more expectations in. So the things that are being measured most prominently are literacy, secondly, potentially numeracy. There's now all sorts of efforts to start measuring social emotional skills and however we measure them. There was an awful lot of conversation a couple of months ago about then how we build in climate smartness and add that as another layer. So I guess a question across this is from me to you, like reflecting some of what I'm hearing in the global space. Our expectations being piled too high, and therefore to reorient professional norms, there is a shopping list that it's impossible for anyone to respond to.
So Yue-Yi needed to leave. So let's continue discussing. Yamini, please go ahead if you have something to add.
Yeah, just wanted to add, one of the things that we noticed a lot, which was this big challenge around autonomy and opening up the teachers' minds to alternative possibilities, was the infusion of short missions, which took the teacher outside of the classroom setting, and gave the teacher therefore a lot more freedom and flexibility to teach children in ways that made sense to them with very clearly defined goals. So in the context of Delhi, the Reading Week, which is an attempt to move children from being non-readers to readers. Or more recently, when schools reopened after COVID, in the government of Delhi, ironically, all the private schools of Delhi, which are supposed to be the good ones, did absolutely nothing. I can tell you from experience, my children walked into school after 2 years and were thrown back to the usual syllabus, but the government schools were trying to sort of do some remedial bridging. And what was really interesting about the COVID moment is it took away from everybody any blame for why there was a learning gap. So teachers and children walked in and everyone had a clean slate. Something out of imagination happened. We tried to do a few things in the interim. Everyone knows they weren't done very effectively. So it's not about the teacher not being able to teach well or children not having the capability to learn. It was an unusual circumstance that that sort of freed the whole system. And we saw this really interesting, for a brief period, complete system alignment between teachers recognizing that children are at different levels, they need to be engaged with in different ways, that teaching cannot be about reading out the textbook and writing on the blackboard because children have forgotten to read or they've forgotten to write and they need to be reoriented, that the classroom cannot be a place of discipline where everybody sits and copies from the blackboard because children are not used to sitting in one place. So suddenly everything sort of came together and the education system too took the pressure off the syllabus. So there was a brief window, a space for lots of experimentation to take place within the confines of remedial. And I think, you know, what I'm looking for now is to see, after these 3-4 months of experimentation of this kind, whether as the system now goes back to the old of focusing again on syllabus, children have come up to a certain level, we are back inside the classroom, it's exam season coming very soon. Do elements of this stay? Because in a way, post the 2 years of COVID, everyone walked into the class on a completely clean slate. So will this be that silver lining that we've been looking for? But the bigger learning, just constant exposure to the possibilities of change, does that make the system work differently?
Thanks, Yamini. I'm going to go to Barbara, and then Bilal, would you like to come in after Barbara does?
Thanks. For some reason I can't put my hand up, so I'm doing it like this. So just on the topic of accountability, and you've all mentioned it, how teachers are suffering from this compliance monitoring that has been prevalent, and it kind of is stifling innovation at the school level, and they don't have the time because of all these administrative duties. I also want to think about accountability from the system's perspective, because we keep talking about teacher accountability, but I feel that, you know, we're saying teachers have to be accountable, but education systems also have to be accountable to their teachers. And sometimes, you know, we are putting teachers in very difficult circumstances, and you can't expect them to be doing the impossible. So if teachers have overcrowded classrooms, or if they don't have the learning, the resources in the classroom, the material, then the system is not being accountable to them. So I think the basics need to be in place before we start pointing the finger at teachers. And then another thing that was raised is about how teachers can be quite isolated in the classroom, and the need to get feedback from their peers. Joaquin, what you were talking to about making that collaboration and that peer feedback. And I think that's really, really important, because it's so much easier to face difficulties when you're with someone else and you're talking problems through. And we all feel it in our day-to-day lives and professional activities. So it's also about making those spaces available for teachers to collaborate and to problem solve together. And if they don't have the time to do that, it's not going to happen. So you have to formalize this collaboration between teachers and try to find time off for them to exchange, to go into each other's classrooms, to role model, to give feedback. And that's, well, research shows that it's effective in terms of improving teaching practices. And it's also really stimulating for teachers, because you get that relatedness with others and you're working at something collectively. It's not your sole responsibility. And you can be creative and see what others are doing. And that is most likely to have an impact on teaching, on changing your practice, rather than going to an ad hoc seminar that is not necessarily linked to the problems that you're facing at this time in your classroom.
Let's go
may I jump in for a second? may I?
Okay, just really quickly, then I do.
Yeah, really quickly, yes. I mean, I really believe there's like two teacher norms that are maybe the firsts among equals. One is, do teachers believe that all children can learn? And the second is, do they feel that they can learn from their peers and that they can expose their work and share their work with their peers, and our peers would be receptive, or would people be threatened? I remember years ago hearing in Chile that teachers who got the bonus for performance bonus tried to keep it quiet because they were embarrassed, because they thought other teachers in the school might resent them. Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks, Barbara. We'll look forward to hearing more from you at the closing. Bilal, over to you. And as I bring you in, I want to fold in another question, which is a question from Stephen Cleese, which is, should we reorient teacher norms toward a broader definition of student learning? And I think another aspect to think about from there is like, how can teacher norms, or should teacher norms, balance the multiple purposes of learning, right? And back to the agency and power question, like who chooses what this balance is and should be. But Bilal, feel free to speak to that or to any other part that you just had thoughts on.
Yeah, I would like to also reflect on teacher accountability, teacher autonomy. In our context, teachers were tested for content mastery and they scored lower, and they have been blamed in the media that they are having lower score, etc. And I totally disagree with that kind of blame because it is a system that creates this kind of skills and competencies. So I was saying, stop blaming the teacher, just focus on changing the system. So the accountability should start with the system accountability, and then we can slowly move to the teacher accountability. In fact, we have seen in our context few schools as model schools, the best schools. And we further explored what happened to these schools. Why are they model schools? And the key factor was the school principal who engaged the teachers. And this school principal didn't wait for any kind of autonomy to come to the school. So he was initiating and encouraging the teachers to do their best, and that school becomes very productive school. So it's also, there are few schools that change the system, and the issue of hope comes in here that you mentioned earlier. Yeah. Back to you.
Barbara, Tony, did you want to come back in, or were you just
Nope.
Okay, then anyone want to weigh in on the question of how norms can balance different purposes of teaching, and whose balance should that be? If not, I can throw another question into the mix. So this is a question from Lindsay Brown. They say, in my experience, teachers are hugely underutilized as problem solvers. Providing a space for teachers to share common problems and discuss strategies to solve them can both provide additional support to teachers and change the nature of how teachers relate to each other. And this also builds on the point that I think Barbara Bruns was making just now, and Barbara Tonier, is also how do teachers feel like they can learn from each other, and like how important and changeable is this norm?
I can jump in. So yes, I hear your point, Barbara Bruns, about how teachers can feel threatened in a way to open up their classroom and to have other teachers come and visit. And in the research that we've conducted, in the systems that we've looked at, we realized that it's something that takes time, and you have to build the trust. And that is really, really key. And you also need to make sure that you've clearly separating the formative assessment from the summative assessment. So those mentor teachers who, well, role model teachers who are coming into your classroom, they have absolutely no stake in your evaluation, and they're kind of following a clear protocol that means that they're not judging in any way, and that they try to get the teachers themselves to come up with the solution rather than them giving it to them. And then over some time, then teachers themselves feel that they value this interaction. But it's true that it can be a little bit daunting in the beginning.
Great. Joaquin, Laura, Belay, you want to come in with any thoughts? Yamini? They don't have to be related to the questions, as I said before. Feel free to direct questions at each other if you want. I think Joaquin and Yamini both want to come in.
So there is another issue about how the teaching profession is perceived and in which sense is oriented to. And an issue that I think we need to address is to move the teaching profession from like a superhero perspective to a professional perspective. I think this norm affects also how the teaching profession is perceived and their work. So although we know that teachers are the most important factor to improve student systems, that doesn't mean that we need to depend on them on everything. So every problem that we have in the school system, we say, okay, teachers, do your work. And also it encourages this idea of teachers being lonely superheroes, doing everything that they can do. And that perspective also affects the professional side of the profession, because we put too much weight in the how do you say, the vocation, in the goodwill, too much weight in their capacity to have overload of work, and not in the how they make learning possible, how they motivate others. And we perceive teachers as like social workers sometimes, like they can solve everything related to the students, and that take time out of the pedagogical aspects. So instead of thinking how we can make students learn and be motivated with learning, we are putting pressure on teachers to solve all kinds of social problems in students. So this is, I think, a huge issue that we have among teachers' norms, and that also affects the attractiveness of the teaching profession. And also, like Generation Z, the new generations, they want to balance better like work and personal life in comparison with other generations. And if we show that teachers are exhausted doing everything and not just focusing on their professional aspect, that's also harmful for them and the profession.
So in fact, the point I wanted to make was quite aligned to what Joaquin was just saying, which is, I think particularly in the context of the public school system in a country like India, and I think this is fairly similar across different contexts, that it does tend to, the public system, for good or bad, tends to attract children usually from from low income families. And there is a huge social, but the teaching profession tends to attract teachers from relatively more middle class contexts. And one of the things that a lot of teachers we spend time with in a city like Delhi, which has a very large middle class population, was that, the teachers themselves, the young teachers were just walked into schools and they were simply not prepared for the degree of exposure they were suddenly confronted with, of the harsh realities of what it means to grow up in fairly harsh conditions that poverty presents you with. And in some sense, and many of the younger teachers especially said, the teacher training prepares you to deal with the context of the classroom, but how can you deal with the context of the classroom when the child is so vulnerable and is coming into the classroom from a fairly difficult context? So one example that a teacher gave was that she noticed a child fall falling asleep inside the classroom, and upset by that, sort of tried to discipline this girl. But after the class were finished, she went to talk to this person, to the child, and only to discover that the reason she was falling asleep was because the night before the authorities had come to raise the slum and break the homes from where they were in this unauthorized colony where her family lived. And so she had to spend the night on gosh, I can only think of the Hindi word now, but the cart on which her father used to sell vegetables, and so walked into the classroom traumatized by what she had gone through and also very, very tired. And she said, I didn't have a way of dealing with this. When we talk to the teacher about learning outcomes and what the syllabus expects you to do, what we expect even in our conversations about foundational learning and learning outcomes versus the reality that the teachers are confronting in the classrooms, there is this very big disconnect. So how do we bridge this, and what is it that do we talk a lot about the importance of equality inside classrooms, of equality, of whether the school can be a place that can enable you to cut across class and other social divisions. But I do think that the harsh truth is that there are different kinds of teaching and different kinds of needs that students have depending on or children have from the context that they come from, and teachers have to be better equipped to deal with that. And that does require almost acknowledging that there will be caste, class, gender differences inside a classroom, and teachers have to be, rather than romanticizing the idea of equality, really prepared to deal with these in different ways. And what does that mean? I think in unequal settings, this is a very important issue to deal with.
Thanks so much, Yamini. I'd like to bring in a question that relates both a little bit to sort of the emotional and affective experience of being a teacher, and also the question of inequality. So this is from Cletus Chisanga. Again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. So it's an observation that most teachers suffer from an inferiority complex, especially those working in remote rural areas. So how can we change this norm? And I'd like to bring in specifically Belai, because I know you've done a lot of work on inequality, and also the quotes I had in my presentation earlier about teacher professional identity crisis relates a lot to that. And I'd also like to bring in Laura, because I've heard you speak very sympathetically about just that emotional experience of being a teacher. So in either order, please.
Yeah, we've been doing a research on teacher professional identity, and we found, we called it teacher professional identity crisis after the outcome. The framework for this research is the identity that teachers form is made up of 3 pillars. One is the definition from the self. I am a teacher, I'm passionate to be a teacher, etc. I am type. And the other is from the social perspective, how the public perceives teaching or teachers. And the third pillar is from the system, from the government, from the institutions, how they place teaching as a profession. So a combination of the 3 will give the identity for the person. In our research, we found that teachers are not, they perceive that they are not accepted by the society, they are not respected by the society, and the government is not giving due attention to them. So this is the majority kind of perception. So how can we reverse, or how can we address this kind of crisis? I think there should be a systemic addressing of this issue from the system level, because like the model schools that I have mentioned earlier, few schools can try, but there will be bits and pieces. But at a system level, there should be a system overhaul. And there is initiation that is beginning in Ethiopia right now. We had one College of Teacher Education, and the Ministry of Education has upgraded this to a National University of Education. And the intention is to build the capacity of teacher education in the country, which is a very good hope for us. And through the change in the system, I believe there will be a change that trickles down to each teacher. That's my hope. Otherwise, bits and pieces interventions are here and there. They can make a change, but at a system level, they may not bring that desired result. Yeah.
Laura, just before you come in on that question about teachers' perceptions and inferiority complexes, I just wanted to warn everyone else on the roundtable that after Laura responds, I'm going to go to each of you for one final sentence. And it will just be one sentence because we're close to time. But Laura, floor is yours.
I'll keep it short. I think one of the things about being involved with RISE and the range of people involved with RISE is that you often engage in conversations about teachers that center the humanity of them. And that may sound a little cliched, but we remember they're people. And I think in so many sector and global conversations about teaching, we talk about teachers as if they're kind of a problem to be fixed or a cog in a big machine of very many other problems. And we can never forget that these are people who have kids themselves or who are acutely aware of the fact that they don't understand the curriculum that they're teaching, or as several people have said today, have 1,000 other things going on in their lives. It means that it's not that they don't want to do what, they don't want to achieve learning outcomes for the kids in their class, but the whole system in a way is stacked against them. And I think just to come back, maybe the sentence that I would finish with is to come back on one of the questions in the chat about the definition of learning. I don't think I've ever met a teacher who has said that learning is only being able to read, nor indeed any of the policy practitioners or researchers that I've met over the years who have been involved in this push towards the recognition of this global learning crisis, as we're now all calling it. And I really hope that we don't get to the point in 5 years or 10 years time where we're looking back and saying, oops, by getting foundational learning onto the agenda, we didn't mean just reading. In the way that we now look back on 1990 and say, oops, we didn't mean access without learning. All of us were talking about learning then. We didn't mean that it should just result in a run of kids to school and then not to read. So I think that recognition that teachers, of course, want to build a whole range of other skills, and they want the ultimate goal is not even to achieve those learning outcomes, it's to enable those kids to go on and have choices and potential, realize that potential in life. And let's not think that teachers don't want that.
Thanks, Laura. That sentence had a lot of semicolons, but you're still technically your speaking turn, so we'll allow it. Just a note to everyone in the audience, I'm so sorry that we only got to a fraction of your questions and comments, but as in the previous part of the webinar, we will compile them and share them with all the panelists, so they may follow up with you over email. That's of interest. Okay, so now we have 4 sentences left from each of the panelists. Anyone want to go first, or shall I appoint? Okay. Yeah. Oh, good, great. Go ahead, Yue-Yi.
Okay, one sentence. I would say, stop blaming teachers, start transforming teacher education systems. This is very important for our context because we are pointing fingers at the teachers, which we have recruited them as low-performing ones to be teachers, and then ultimately we blame them. So we need to stop blaming the teachers and change the system, the teacher education system. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Yue-Yi. Barbara Tunia, you're next on my screen. Okay.
Yeah, I can go next. Maybe just to say that I think governments really need to think strategically about the teaching profession, because the effects of the deterioration of the body of teachers, those effects are going to be really difficult to reverse, and they're going to take decades to reverse. So if yes, you've got to invest in your teachers. It's unavoidable if you want to have good learning results. And also in the other roles in the system, we've mentioned the head teachers, and increasingly research is focalizing on those because we know that they're going to have a multiplier effect across classrooms. But we haven't started to look also at the other levels, which will also have a multiplier effect.
Great. Thanks, Barbara. Joaquin, I think you are ready.
Yeah. The world needs teachers, more and better supported teachers to achieve quality of education, and spaces like this contribute to reflect about the importance. And from Elige Educar, we also offer our experience to promote how to attract, recruit, and retain teachers in the teaching profession. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Yamini, round us out.
Thank you. So there is a dissonance. I think society values teachers and the teaching profession, and the education system undermines teachers and the core purpose of the profession, which is teaching in the classroom. So restoring the value and dignity of the act of teaching into the profession in the education system is, I think, at the heart of what will reorient and shift norms. And maybe in our own deliberations and framing of the challenge, perhaps we want to think about it not so much as teacher norms, as much as teaching norms within the education system that may move the entire system towards accountability for learning rather than accountability for examinations.
Great. Thanks, Yamini. Well, it's good that that wasn't an exam question because we all fail our understanding of what a sentence is, but those thoughts are so rich and I'm so grateful. It's been such a pleasure, this panel, so much challenge, so much hope from these reflections, also from the volume. So thank you so much for being a part of it. And back to Michelle.
Great, thank you. And I'll just echo the thanks to our great roundtable and discussions and the questions and answers from questions from the audience as well. With that, I want to go ahead and hand it over to Barbara to share her reflections and some closing remarks with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Yue-Yi. And next slide, please, Joe. First, I want to echo the things other people have said to congratulate Yue-Yi for this totally original research. I've never seen anything like it, and it really makes for fascinating and illuminating reading. Especially as an economist, I see so much research focused on incentives and accountability instruments, but very little exploration of the soft forces shaping who teachers are and how they perform. So let me, the diversity of perspectives and the diversity of countries is really staggering, but let me move to the next slide and say that what really hit me was there are a number of common issues that you see across widely different country contexts. The first is, as Belay had stressed, a profession of declining standards and prestige. Belay has a story of an Ethiopian novice teacher being actually chastised by the school director for joining a low status profession. Surveys in Peru show that teaching is a last resort. The facts show that both relative salaries and the relative academic quality of teachers has declined across the developing world and a number of OECD countries over the last couple of decades. 40% of teachers in Brazil now are trained through online-only courses with no classroom practice, which is something Jacobus referred to in the prior session. And there's a disconnect because in many countries, formal qualifications have really increased. Many teachers now have master's degrees, but but tests show that their content mastery is still weak and that the national and teacher candidates score below the national average on PISA in many countries. So how can you have your weakest students, people with the weakest content mastery, transmitting content mastery to the next generation? Next slide, please. So a second common issue that you see across all of these conversations is ill-conceived and overambitious curricula that forces teachers to chase the curriculum and move faster than they think they should through topics, and especially to have to do a triage because they realize that they can't give enough attention to the weaker students, and so they're under pressure to improve pass rates, so they start focusing on the better students. And beyond that, there's even there's this corrosive belief in many countries that not all students can learn, and especially children from poor and disadvantaged backgrounds won't learn. And that the education system, it's justified that it's a winnowing process, so that the students who work hardest and do best deserve more support and attention and deserve to advance. Third, next slide, please. The third theme that's come out is that teachers are very often cogs in the civil service. They're hired into permanent jobs. They cannot be fired, and there's an obedience culture in Indonesia, for example, where being an excellent teacher is second to being a good civil servant. And I've seen countries where teachers' absence to do election duty, vaccination campaigns, or whatever is completely acceptable. And in many, many democracies, education is a core instrument of clientelist public sector. Number of these panelists today have talked about teachers, school directors, district supervisors being political appointments, not meritocratic appointments. So, and, teacher tenure, teacher promotions and salaries in most countries are delinked from their performance or students' learning. Next, please. So it paints a pretty dismal picture, but the conversations also really illuminate a number of ways forward. And that's the exciting part. One theme that comes across a lot is the need to simplify and reform the curriculum and prioritize foundational literacy and numeracy for all children as like the gateway to all future learning. And there's been a lot of research. We know a lot more than we did 10 years ago about how to do this effectively. And a couple of key common elements are continuous assessment of student progress, scripted learning materials, and student groupings and self-paced exercises that allow for progress at different speeds. Pratham, Escuela Nueva, the Khan Academy, a lot of new techniques for achieving this. And equally important is this changing teachers' beliefs by showing them that the same children can learn more. As Wendy Kopp said, progress at the classroom level is 40% driven by teachers' mindsets and 60% technique. So this idea of the norm in the profession becoming that all students can learn, and showing teachers that that can be achieved is really important. Next slide, please. To show teachers that this can be achieved, you need effective support for teacher practice. The ideal is school level teacher collaboration, and more countries are developing, building into the school calendar time in the day for teacher and the time in the week for teachers to get together. There's increasing interest in teacher coaching models. In Peru and Ceará, Brazil have done that, and the Escuela Nueva has done this effectively. And then, even when teachers, I don't want to call it rote teaching, but high quality textbooks and effective learning materials can leverage system expertise and make the work easier for all teachers. It's efficient. I mean, in Finland and Vietnam are good examples of this. And the STIR program is working to reignite teacher motivation and get group teachers to work together and learn from each other and create a norm around shared practice. There are a couple of other examples that come out in these dialogues from Uganda. And I guess the bottom message is, like, as Jacobus Cilliers said in the earlier session, don't try to teach a baker to bake by never showing them how to do it, by teaching them the theory of baking. So avoid wasted spending on teacher professional development and focus on things that will really work at the school and classroom level. Next slide, please. And then the third theme is improving the basics. The third grade classroom in Tanzania pictured here with 80 students, how can one teacher be expected to have all those children become literate? In a context like that, it's an impossible challenge. So some of the basics include better learning measurement, and including national assessment systems and cross-country benchmarking, participating in regional examinations, getting the politics out of system management, which means, as this panelists have referred to, system managers and school directors being appointed by political connections rather than capacity.
Barbara, about 2 minutes left.
Okay, so next one, please. Strengthen connections with the community, and Pratham does this by bringing all the community and mothers into the school at the beginning of the year, and teachers' voice and buy-in. Barbara Tournier's work has shown that it's a very important strategy to get consultation of teachers if you want to have their support for the implementation of the program. Next slide, please. And this is the most complex. It's the comprehensive teacher career path reforms that are necessary to raise teacher quality and return prestige to the profession. I think Chile is maybe one of the best model now of raising the standards for teacher entry into pre-service training. And then that makes it much easier to, you're selecting, DeJaeghere has been very important in this. You're selecting high talent students, high talent people at the beginning. And then if you reform your career path and your salary levels to make their incentives to stay in the profession and promote them on the basis of performance rather than years of service. That's the direction of change. It's extremely difficult politically and technically, but I think you can't expect to have a high performing profession if a teacher who's absent from school gets promoted and rewarded and paid exactly the same as a teacher who's really killing him or herself to do a great job. And last, harness the power of school culture. I think a number of people have referred to the importance of norms set at the school level by, school leaders as maybe the most critical point of change in the system. And we know more about how to select and support school leaders. And so I think that, it's countries that are grappling with how to make sure that they're finding the people with potential to be a truly transformative school leader and supporting them is really the way of the future. Thank you. Last slide. School in Sao Tome. And read the book. No matter how much you already know, you will learn from this book.
Thank you so much, Barbara. You summarized it so well and didn't leave us on just the dismal note, but I think suggested a lot of positive ways forward. So thanks so much for pulling together so many of the different elements from the book in your
trying to
there. Yeah, it's an impressive feat even just to pull it all together because there's so much content in the volume itself. So thank you, Barbara. Thank you to all of our discussants and panelists. It's been such a rich conversation. Both in part one of the webinar here on the roundtable to hear some of this great content coming out of the book and volume. I'll also put in that plug to say, go read it. Congratulations to Yue-Yi for all of her work in getting it to this point and getting it out. Yeah, so just a reminder that the volume is now available on the website. Do go check it out. And one last plug, Joe, if you could do the last slide. I think there's one more after that. Yes, we have one last webinar coming up in this series on learning trajectories and a new online data tool that the RISE program has developed with in partnership with the GEM report folks at UNESCO. And we will be, it's launched already, but we'll be doing a webinar about it and kind of doing a walkthrough of the data tool on December 6th. So please do look at joining us for that final webinar in the series. And just a big thank you again for everyone for joining us today. And yeah, best of luck in these bodies of work. Thanks, everyone.